Welcome to Calming Bedtime Historian and Channel. Tonight we wander into the freezing streets of New York during one of the deadliest snowstorms Americans had ever witnessed. Imagine standing beneath a grey March sky while icy wind cuts through your heavy wool coat. Horses panic beside frozen streetcars and snow piles so high that entire doorways disappear before morning. How did ordinary people survive when the city suddenly stopped breathing normally? What happened when communication failed, transportation collapsed, and thousands found themselves stranded in the largest city in America? So before you settle into the story, take a second to like the video and hit subscribe. And while you are getting comfortable tonight, leave a comment sharing your location and local time. It is always fascinating seeing where everyone listens from around the world. Now dim the lights and let yourself drift slowly into New York City, March 1888. You wake before sunrise inside a narrow Manhattan boarding house, wrapped beneath thick wool blankets that still hold traces of coal smoke. The room feels colder than yesterday. Not terribly cold, just enough to make you hesitate before leaving the bed. Outside your frosted window, the city remains unusually quiet. That silence feels strange. New York rarely sleeps completely in 1888. Somewhere nearby, carts usually rattle over stones before dawn. Dock workers shout along the waterfront. Horses snort impatiently beside crowded curbs. Yet this morning the noise arrives soft and muffled beneath a damp layer of air. You dress carefully beside a small wash basin. The water feels painfully cold against your fingertips. You quickly regret touching it. Small comforts disappear fast during 19th century winters. Indoor plumbing exists in wealthy homes, but many buildings still rely upon pumps, buckets, and shared facilities. A cozy modern bathroom would seem almost magical here. The smell of burning coal drifts through the hallway. It mixes with cabbage from last night's supper and wet wool drying beside the kitchen stove downstairs. Boarding houses carried their own atmosphere during winter months. Heavy fabric absorbed smoke, sweat, steam, and cooking odours until entire buildings seemed permanently seasoned like old soup pots. You descend the narrow staircase slowly. The landlady stands near the entrance holding folded newspapers beneath her arm. She squints towards the front windows with visible concern. According to several weather reports, a storm is approaching from the Atlantic coast. That alone surprises nobody. March storms regularly sweep across New York. Still, something feels unsettled today. You step outside carefully onto the sidewalk. Cold air immediately brushes your cheeks with sharper force than expected. The sky hangs low and grey above crowded brick buildings. Thin flakes drift lazily downward, almost harmless looking at first glance. You have seen worse. Nearly everyone around you believes the same thing. Workers continue pushing carts through busy intersections. Shopkeepers unlock doors. Children hurry along sidewalks carrying books and lunch pails. Life moves forward with stubborn confidence. A respected historical observation from the era notes that many New Yorkers initially underestimated the Great Blizzard because the morning began with relatively ordinary snowfall. Nobody yet understands how quickly conditions will turn deadly. You walk south along Broadway. Horse hooves strike wet pavement with rhythmic clacks. Streetcars rumble forward carrying office clerks wrapped in scarves and long dark coats. Elevated railway trains screech overhead, dropping sparks into the cold morning air. The city smells alive. Coal smoke rises from hundreds of chimneys. Fresh bread escapes bakery doors. Wet leather horse manure and sea air mingle together in strange urban harmony. 19th century New York never smelled particularly pleasant, yet people grew accustomed to it the same way sailors stopped noticing ocean salt. Snowflakes gather slowly upon your sleeves. You pause beside a newspaper stand where headlines discuss politics, labour disputes and weather predictions. Forecasting remained imperfect during the 1880s. Meteorologists relied upon scattered telegraph reports and personal observations rather than advanced satellite systems. Sometimes they guessed correctly, sometimes they absolutely did not. A curious little detail from the period reveals that some New Yorkers trusted aching joints more than official forecasts. Elderly residents often claim their knees predicted storms better than government weather bureaus. Considering what arrives later, a few people probably felt extremely smug about those painful knees. You continue moving downtown. The wind strengthens gradually between buildings. Not violent yet, just persistent. It snakes through alleyways and under coat collars with irritating precision. You pull your scarf tighter around your neck. Nearby, two businessmen laugh outside a tobacco shop. One insists the storm will pass northward before evening. The other complains dramatically about ruined leather boots. Neither sounds worried. New Yorkers pride themselves on endurance. Harsh winters, crowded conditions, and difficult labor shaped daily life here. Complaining existed constantly of just but stopping entirely, almost never. You pass immigrant families speaking Italian, German, and Yiddish beside crowded storefronts. The city already contains enormous cultural diversity by 1888. Over 2 million people live in New York and neighboring Brooklyn combined. Many survive through exhausting physical work requiring long hours outdoors, regardless of weather. Snow thickens around midday. The flakes grow heavier south, spinning wildly through the air. Street gutters begin disappearing beneath pale slush. Horses lower their heads against strengthening gusts while drivers shout impatiently from wagons. Something shifts in the atmosphere. You notice it first through sound. The city slowly loses sharpness. Snow absorbs noise, strangely softening wheels and footsteps beneath growing layers of white. Even conversation seemed quieter. A few pedestrians glance upward nervously. The wind bites harder now against exposed skin. Tiny ice particles sting your cheeks like thrown sand. You duck briefly inside a coffee house seeking warmth. The interior feels wonderfully crowded. Steam rises from damp coats hanging beside the entrance. Spoons clink against ceramic cups. Men warm frozen hands near cast iron stoves while discussing weather conditions with increasing seriousness. One sailor predicts disaster. Another man dismisses him immediately. Historians continue debating whether city officials fully grasped the storm's severity before transportation systems collapsed entirely. Communication technology remained limited, and conditions changed with terrifying speed during those crucial afternoon hours. You sip hot coffee slowly. It tastes bitter and smoky, but warmth spreads pleasantly through your chest. Outside the windows, snow now blows sideways. Gospel. Way. Visibility shrinks block by block. A delivery boy bursts through the cafe door carrying snow across the floorboards. His face looks pale beneath melting flakes. He announces that elevated trains already face delays uptown. Several streetcars have stalled completely. Conversation story. Stop briefly. Nobody panics yet. Still you sense unease spreading quietly across the crowded room like cold water beneath the locked door. You return outside after finishing the coffee. The storm greets you immediately with sharper fury. Wind roars between buildings hard enough to force your body sideways. Snow swirls upward from the streets instead of simply falling downward. That always feels unnatural. The city ahead appears blurred and ghostly now. Store signs vanish behind curtains of blowing white. Men lean forward while walking as though climbing steep invisible hills. A horse nearby suddenly rears upward in panic. Its driver struggles desperately to regain control while pedestrians scatter across the sidewalk. Snowflakes gather thickly upon the animal's mane until it resembles a moving statue carved from salt. The temperature continues dropping. You pull your coat tighter, breathing through wool fabric dampened by ice and condensation. Each inhale smells faintly of coal smoke and frozen leather. Darkness arrives earlier than expected. Gas lamps flicker awake across the avenue while afternoon still lingers weakly overhead. Their yellow glow barely penetrates the growing storm, and somewhere beyond the white chaos surrounding Manhattan tonight, the true blizzard finally awakens. The storm changes personality sometime after sunset. Earlier the snow felt inconvenient. live. You stand near the entrance of a crowded dry goods store while violent wind tears through the avenue outside. Snow lashes the windows so fiercely that passing figures appear only as vague shadows moving inside white chaos. Every few moments the door bursts open. Cold air rushes across the wooden floorboards, carrying powdered snow onto boots and carpets. Customers stamp their feet beside glowing oil lamps while shop clerks argue about whether businesses should close early. Most already know the answer. The city is shutting down by force. You finally step back outside after gathering enough courage to face the storm again. Instantly, icy wind grabs your coat like invisible hands. Breathing becomes difficult. Snow blasts sideways into your eyes and ears, melting briefly against skin before freezing again. The street barely resembles Manhattan anymore. Horse-drawn omnibuses sit abandoned beside curbs beneath growing drifts. Drivers struggle to calm exhausted animals trembling beneath layers of snow. Somewhere nearby, metal wheels scrape uselessly against frozen tracks. The sound feels desperate. You lower your head and continue forward carefully. Gas lamps flicker weakly through the storm, their yellow glow swallowed almost immediately by swirling white darkness. Visibility shrinks to only a few yards ahead. Familiar storefronts disappear entirely behind moving curtains of snow. You nearly collide with another pedestrian. Both of you mumble apologies before continuing opposite directions into the blizzard. Encounters like this happen constantly now. People emerge suddenly from white emptiness, then vanish again seconds later. The wind screams between buildings, not whistles, not howls, it screams. The noise bounces through narrow streets with eerie force almost human at moments. Many survivors later describe the blizzard's sound more vividly than its appearance. Endless roaring filled every corner of the city for hours without pause. A documented historical detail explains that wind speeds during the Great Blizzard reportedly exceeded 40 miles per hour in some areas, creating snowdrifts taller than adults throughout New York streets. You feel every mile of that wind. Snow reaches above your ankles now. Each step demands effort. Your boots grow soaked despite thick leather construction. Cold moisture slowly creeps through wool socks and settles unpleasantly against your toes. That is dangerous. Very dangerous. People in 1888 understood frostbite well enough, even without modern medical explanations. Losing fingers or toes during severe winters remained a genuine possibility for labourers, sailors, and anyone trapped outdoors too long. You pass a stalled streetcar half buried beside the curb. Passengers still sit inside beneath dim lantern light. Their faces appear tired and uneasy through frosted windows. Several men push against the rear wheels while the conductor shouts instructions nobody can hear clearly above the wind. The horses refuse to move. Honestly, they deserve respect for trying at all. Working horses carried enormous responsibility in 19th century cities. They hauled transportation deliveries, construction materials, and emergency equipment through miserable conditions. During the blizzard, thousands became stranded or collapsed from exhaustion. Snow strikes your face sharply again. You pull a wool cap lower across your forehead and continue downtown toward your boarding house. The journey feels longer now. Streets twist strangely beneath drifting snow, corners vanish, curbs disappear. Even experienced residents struggle recognizing neighborhoods. You smell smoke somewhere nearby. Coal smoke usually comforts city residents during winter. Tonight it mixes with icy air in harsher ways, carrying the scent of overheated furnaces and crowded chimneys battling against deepening cold. Ahead, several policemen guide confused pedestrians toward shelter. Their dark coats already appear white from accumulated snow. One officer grips a rope stretched between buildings to avoid losing direction entirely. That detail sounds dramatic now, but ropes genuinely helped people navigate during severe whiteout conditions. A strange little story circulated after the storm about pet canaries warning owners before conditions worsened. Some residents claimed nervous birds fluttered wildly hours before the blizzard peaked. Whether the canaries sensed pressure changes or simply hated terrible weather remains uncertain. You finally reach an intersection crowded with stranded commuters. Frustration hangs heavily in the freezing air. Men shout toward elevated tracks overhead where stalled trains sit motionless beneath thick snow accumulation. Women clutch parcels tightly while searching anxiously for transportation home. Nobody moves quickly anymore. The storm controls the pace now. You overhear rumors spreading through the crowd. Telegraph lines north of the city may already be failing. Brooklyn ferries face dangerous ice buildup. Several train routes have stopped entirely outside Manhattan. Nobody knows which rumors are true. That uncertainty frightens people almost more than the cold itself. You push onward carefully through rising drifts. The snow reaches your shins in some places. Wind drives loose ice crystals beneath collars and sleeves no matter how tightly clothing remains wrapped. Your cheeks feel numb now. So do your fingertips. Nearby, a restaurant owner waves strangers indoors. Inside, warmth strikes immediately. The dining room overflows with soaked travelers crowded shoulder to shoulder beneath smoky chandeliers. Wet coats steam beside cast-iron stoves. The smell of coffee, onion, soup, tobacco, and damp wool fills every inch of air. People speak more softly here. Fear does that sometimes. A scholarly debate still continues regarding how many deaths the blizzard truly caused across the Northeast. Official numbers varied widely, and many victims likely disappeared unnoticed among poorer immigrant populations living near docks and overcrowded tenements. You accept a bowl of hot stew from the exhausted cook. It tastes heavily salted and slightly burnt. Under ordinary circumstances, you might complain quietly. Tonight it feels magnificent. Simple warmth becomes precious during disasters. The restaurant owner explains that many businesses remain open only to shelter stranded pedestrians. Hotels already overflow with unexpected guests. Churches and saloons offer temporary refuge wherever space allows. That mixture feels very New York somehow. One man prays beside another, drinking whiskey while both stare anxiously towards snow-covered windows. Hours pass slowly inside the crowded restaurant. Outside, conditions worsen further. Snow piles halfway across lower windows now. Every time the entrance opens, drifted snow spills directly onto the floorboards. Several travelers decide remaining overnight seems safer than attempting the streets again. You consider doing the same, but your boarding house lies only several blocks farther. At least you hope it does. Distances feel unreliable tonight. Eventually you step outside once more. The storm greets you with brutal force. Wind nearly steals your breath immediately. Darkness has deepened fully across the city, though snow reflects enough gaslight to create an eerie glowing haze everywhere. Manhattan appears submerged beneath frozen fog. You move carefully along buried sidewalks. Buildings loom beside you, like cliffs emerging from snow clouds. Somewhere nearby, church bells ring faintly through the storm, though the sound arrives distorted by roaring wind. Then something remarkable happens. For one brief moment, the avenue falls strangely empty around you. No carts, no voices, no footsteps. Only snow swirling endlessly beneath flickering lamps. The mighty city suddenly feels fragile, very small, and somewhere beyond the frozen harbour tonight, Atlantic winds continue feeding the storm that now holds New York completely within its frozen grip. Morning arrives reluctantly across Manhattan. You notice the light first. A pale grey glow pushes weakly through layers of blowing snow outside your boarding house window. Sometime during the night, the storm transformed the entire city into something unfamiliar and almost dreamlike. You sit upright beneath heavy blankets, listening carefully. The wind still roars. It rattles windows with steady violence and pushes icy drafts through tiny cracks around the frame. Somewhere downstairs, pipes knock faintly inside the walls while tenants move slowly through the building, searching for warmth and coffee. Nobody slept particularly well. The landlady already stands near the stove when you descend into the dining room. Her expression looks exhausted. Several stranded strangers spent the night sleeping on chairs, carpets, and benches throughout the house. One man snores beside the fireplace. Honestly, he looks peaceful compared to everyone else. The smell of burnt coffee and damp wool fills the crowded room again. Wet gloves hang beside the stove. Snow-covered boots line the walls beneath dripping coats. Someone quietly stirs oatmeal in a dented iron pot while another tenant attempts reading yesterday's newspaper beside weak lamplight. News no longer feels current. The storm changes conditions hourly. You approach the front entrance carefully. The door opens only halfway. Snow blocks the remainder. That sight alone leaves the rooms buoyant for several seconds. A drift nearly reaches the middle of the doorway outside. The street beyond has disappeared entirely beneath rolling white hills sculpted by furious wind overnight. You step outside cautiously. Cold air hits immediately with enough force to sting your lungs. Snow crunches beneath your boots in deep, uneven layers. In some places, the drifts rise above your knees already. The city looks buried. Windows on lower floors vanish behind snowbanks. Street signs barely remain visible through swirling ice crystals. Wagons sit abandoned like forgotten toys beneath thick white blankets. Even sound behaves differently now. New York normally experiences with constant motion and noise. Today the storm muffles everything beneath endless wind and snow. Distant voices seem swallowed instantly by the blizzard. You begin moving carefully southward. Each step requires effort. Snowdrifts form strange shapes between buildings, sometimes smooth as ocean waves, sometimes jagged like frozen cliffs. Wind pushes loose powder across the streets in ghostly spirals that dance around your legs. You pass two men digging desperately toward a buried storefront entrance. Their shovels scrape heavily against packed snow while steam rises from their breath. One pauses briefly to wipe ice from his beard before returning to work without complaint. That determination appears everywhere today. A widely accepted historical fact explains that many New Yorkers survived the blizzard only through immediate neighborhood cooperation. Residents shared food, shelter, fuel, and labor because official emergency systems remained limited during the late 19th century. Communities that became rescue teams. You continue forward beside half-visible gas lamps. Several poles lean dangerously beneath ice accumulation. Telegraph wires sag overhead, coated in thick frozen layers that glitter faintly through blowing snow. Occasionally the wind shakes them loose with eerie metallic sounds. The air smells sharply metallic too. Ice smoke, wet wood, horse sweat, and coal fumes blend together into a scent uniquely tied to severe winter storms. You taste cold iron with nearly every breath. Ahead, a group of children slides laughing down a massive drift beside an abandoned carriage. That seems unbelievable at first, yet children often adapt faster than adults during disasters. Fear mixes easily with curiosity when you are young. Some survivors later recalled children treating portions of the blizzard almost like an unexpected holiday. Their parents probably felt less cheerful. You reach Broadway slowly, or at least you think it is Broadway. Landmarks appear distorted beneath the enormous snow accumulation. Elevated railway tracks overhead resemble frozen skeletons stretching into white emptiness. Trains remain stranded motionless above the avenue coated completely in snow and ice. No smoke rises from them anymore. Passengers were evacuated hours earlier. A curious tidbit from the storm tells of stranded commuters climbing down ladders from elevated trains directly into snowdrifts below. Some passengers reportedly spent hours trapped before rescue crews reached them through impossible conditions. You glance upward uneasily. The tracks groan softly in the wind. Nearby, several policemen assist an elderly woman across buried street crossings. They move carefully while holding one another's arms against powerful gusts. Their faces appear raw and red from constant exposure. Nobody remains dry anymore. Not completely. Snow finds every opening eventually. Boots soak through. Gloves stiffen with ice. Scarves freeze around mouths after repeated breaths. The human body loses heat steadily in weather like this, even beneath heavy layers. You pause beside a bakery crowded with anxious customers. Inside, the atmosphere feels warmer but tense. Bread shelves already appear thinner than usual. Delivery wagons cannot move properly through the storm, leaving many businesses uncertain about incoming supplies. Fresh bread smells wonderful here. Warm yeast and fior briefly overpower the smoke lingering in your coat. People clutch loaves beneath scarves and blankets before hurrying back into the storm. Nobody lingers outside voluntarily now. A scholarly uncertainty still surrounds how many isolated neighborhoods remained unreachable during the storm's worst hours. Historians examining personal diaries discovered conflicting accounts from different districts suggesting portions of the city experienced conditions almost independently from one another. That isolation changes people psychologically. The farther you walk today, the more disconnected Manhattan feels from the rest of America. Telegraph failures spread rapidly overnight. Railroad lines vanish beneath drifts. Ferries struggle against frozen waters. New York begins feeling trapped. You continue toward Lower Manhattan through waist-deep passages carved by pedestrians. In some places, people tunnel directly through drifts taller than their shoulders. Shovel crews labor constantly while fresh snow immediately fills cleared paths behind them. It must feel maddening. Maddening. You overhear fragments of conversation passing nearby. A woman worries about relatives in Brooklyn. A dock worker claims entire ships remain frozen along the harbour. Another man insists more snow still approaches from the coast. Nobody knows what to believe anymore. The storm distorts information as effectively as it buries streets. Suddenly, a violent gust sweeps across the avenue. Snow explodes upward around you so densely that visibility disappears completely for several terrifying seconds. White swirls across every direction. Sky and ground merge together. You cannot even see your own boots clearly. That sensation feels deeply unsettling. Humans rely heavily upon visible horizons. Remove those boundaries and the mind begins drifting strangely. Several blizzard survivors later describe temporary panic when familiar streets vanished entirely within whiteout conditions. The gust finally weakens. Buildings slowly reappear through blowing snow. You breathe carefully again while steadying yourself beside a buried fence. Nearby church bells ring faintly through the storm, though distance and wind twist the sound into mournful echoes. The city keeps surviving somehow, not gracefully, not comfortably, but stubbornly. And as freezing snow continues piling higher across Manhattan today, ordinary people everywhere keep digging, sharing, rescuing, cooking, carrying, and enduring beneath one of the harshest storms New York has ever known. You hear the horses before you see them. Their frightened cries echo through the storm from somewhere ahead along the buried avenue. The sound cuts sharply through the endless roar of wind and rattling ice. Animals understand danger quickly, sometimes faster than people. You move carefully through shoulder-high drifts that nearly erase the street itself. Snow presses against your leg with exhausting weight. Each step sinks unevenly into hidden ridges beneath the surface. The city feels reshaped overnight. Streetcar tracks vanish completely beneath packed snow. Curbs no longer separate roads from sidewalks. Entire intersections blend into broad white fields broken only by gas lamps and stranded vehicles. Ahead, several men struggle beside a stalled streetcar. The horses remain harnessed to the frozen car, their dark bodies coated with snow and frost. Steam pours heavily from their nostrils while drivers shout encouragement above the wind. The wheels refuse to move, no matter how hard the animals pull. One horse slips suddenly and crashes sideways into the drift. Snow erupts around its body. Nearby passengers rush forward to help steady the terrified creature before it injures itself against the frozen harness. You can smell the animals from several yards away. Wet leather, horse sweat, cold iron, the sharp scent of fear. Transportation in New York during 1888 depended almost entirely upon horses. Tens of thousands worked daily across Manhattan hauling people freight coal mail and food through crowded streets. When the blizzard immobilized them, the entire city machinery slowed toward collapse. You pause beside the stranded streetcar briefly. Passengers remain crowded inside beneath dim lantern light. Frost clings to the windows from human breath. Some riders appear calm while others stare anxiously into the storm outside. Nobody expected this journey to become an overnight survival ordeal. A lesser-known account from the storm describes commuters trapped inside frozen rail cars for nearly 8 hours before rescue crews reached them. Some passengers reportedly sang songs together, simply to remain awake and calm during the worst conditions. Honestly, singing sounds preferable to panicking. The conductor finally orders everyone off the car. That process takes time. Women clutch heavy skirts above the snow while men form rough pathways through the drifted street. One older passenger nearly disappears waist-deep after stepping away from the packed trail. The storm punishes carelessness immediately. You continue onward while wind tears across the avenue in furious bursts. Snowflakes no longer resemble soft flakes at all. They feel like icy grains striking exposed skin with constant irritation. Your scarf freezes near your mouth. Each breath leaves moisture trapped within the wool until the fabric stiffens against your face. Gloves fare little better. Fingers ache despite constant movement. Ahead, elevated railway tracks loom above the avenue like frozen bridges disappearing into white fog. No trains move there now, only silence. Before the blizzard, elevated railroads represented modern urban progress. Crowded steam-powered trains carried thousands across Manhattan every day above congested streets, yet the storm exposed how vulnerable elevated systems remained against severe winter weather. Snow gathered faster than crews could remove it. Ice froze switches and rail solid. Engines stalled helplessly across the city. You notice several workers climbing carefully along the elevated platform overhead. Their coats whip violently in the wind while they swing shovels against packed snow. The labour looks terrifying from below. One misplaced step could kill a man. A surprising rumour spread after the storm claiming that desperate commuters offered workers cash simply for dangerous rides atop snowplow engines. Some newspapers exaggerated those stories dramatically afterward, though fragments of truth probably existed beneath the sensational reporting. New Yorkers love dramatic storytelling almost as much as surviving disasters. You turn toward a narrower side street seeking shelter from the wind. The difference feels immediate. Buildings block some of the gusts here, though. Deep drifts fill the alley almost entirely. Snow piles halfway up door frames. Residents dig narrow trenches connecting entrances like tiny frozen corridors. You pass a family hauling coal buckets together. The father leads while two older children carry smaller containers behind him. Their mother balances wrapped bundles beneath one arm while shielding her face with the other hand. No body waste movement to this. Every task demands effort. An observation repeated in many personal diaries from the period reveals how quickly ordinary winter chores became physically exhausting during the blizzard. Fetching coal, carrying water, or buying bread suddenly resembled expedition work. You smelt a soup drifting from somewhere nearby. The scent reaches you unexpectedly through the cold air. Onion broth and pepper float briefly across the buried alley before vanishing again beneath sharper smells of coal smoke and frozen wood. Simple food becomes deeply comforting during storms. People crave heat as much as flavor. You finally reach a crowded boarding stable near the next avenue. Several exhausted horses stand packed closely together beneath hanging lanterns, while stable workers brush snow from their coats. The warmth inside feels almost tropical compared to outdoors. Steam rises from the animals in thick clouds. Hay covers the floor. The smell hits immediately and powerfully. Sweat manure, lair, the wet straw and oats combine into one overwhelming stable scent. Oddly enough, it feels reassuring. The stable owner allows stranded pedestrians inside briefly to warm themselves near the animals. Horses generate enormous body heat. In desperate weather, stables occasionally became emergency shelters for people as well as livestock. You hold your hands near a lantern, slowly regaining feeling in your fingers. Nearby workers discuss worsening conditions uptown. Several streetcars remain abandoned entirely. Snowdrifts reportedly reach second-story windows in certain exposed areas near open streets. Some listeners shake their heads in disbelief. Others simply nod wearily. At this point, nothing sounds impossible anymore. Researchers studying survivor testimony continue disagreeing over which neighborhood suffered most severely during the height of the storm. Wind direction, building density, and street layout created wildly different experiences across relatively short distances. New York became dozens of separate weather worlds. You leave the stable reluctantly and return outside. Darkness approaches again. That realization feels discouraging. The storm has already consumed so much time that another evening now arrives before recovery efforts properly begin. Gas lamps flicker weakly through thick snowfall, while workers continue digging useless paths swallowed again minutes later. You hear church bells somewhere downtown, slow, heavy, muffled by snow. The sound drifts strangely through buried streets where ordinary city noise has nearly vanished. No carriage traffic, no shouting vendors, no rattling deliveries. Only wind, only snow, and the distant struggle of thousands of New Yorkers attempting to move through a city suddenly frozen almost completely still. The city loses its voice during the second night of the storm. You notice the change gradually. At first, telegraph offices simply seem crowded. Nervous messengers move between counters carrying damp papers, while operators tap furiously at silent machines. People gather beneath gas lamps hoping for updates from Boston, Philadelphia, or Brooklyn. Then the waiting grows longer. Too long. Inside one narrow telegraph office near Lower Manhattan, the air feels unbearably warm compared to the frozen streets outside. Cold heat presses against your face while wet snow melts from coats across the crowded room. Everyone smells exhausted. Ink, smoke, sweat, damp wool. A clerk wipes frost from the inside of the front window before peering anxiously into the storm. Beside him, several telegraph operators sit hunched over their equipment listening for signals that never properly arrive. Only scattered clicks answer them. Then silence again. The telegraph represented the nervous system of 19th century America. Business transactions, railway schedules, weather reports, political updates, and family news all travelled through those wires overhead. When the blizzard destroyed lines across the northeast, enormous portions of the country suddenly lost communication almost instantly. You watch one operator remove his spectacles tiredly. His fingers tremble slightly from cold and fatigue. For hours he has attempted reaching offices only a few states away. Ice-covered wires sag and snap throughout the storm while powerful winds twist poles sideways across roads and rooftops. Messages vanish into white emptiness. A newspaper editor nearby curses quietly beneath his breath. Without telegraph reports, tomorrow's newspapers become little more than educated guesses. Editors rely heavily upon wire services for national information. Now even neighbouring districts struggle sharing reliable updates. A strange anecdote later circulated about Wall Street brokers wandering telegraph offices, almost desperately searching for financial news, while the blizzard isolated markets from one another. Imagine wealthy businessmen under not by economics but by snowdrifts taller than dining tables. Nature occasionally enjoys embarrassing humanity. You step back outside after warming briefly indoors. The cold strikes harder now after the office heat. Snow continues falling thickly beneath gaslight, though the flakes seem finer tonight, sharper somehow. Wind drives them across your face relentlessly. Telegraph wires overhead hum faintly during powerful gusts. Some lines droop so low that snow nearly buries them. Others hang broken, entirely swaying loose above deserted streets. The city feels cut off from the world. That isolation settles strangely upon people. You pass groups gathered around newspaper boards reading outdated bulletins posted hours earlier. Every rumour spreads quickly now because reliable information travels poorly through the storm. One man insists trains from Albany vanished beneath drifts. Another claims harbour ferries remain trapped in floating ice. A woman worries quietly about relatives in New Jersey, with no possible way to send messages. Nobody can reassure anyone properly. You continue uptown through narrow pathways carved between towering snowbanks. Men carrying lanterns move carefully ahead of you while workers shovel endlessly beside buried storefronts. The snow reflects light in peculiar ways tonight. Gas lamps cast golden halos across drifts shaped by violent wind. Windows glow warmly behind layers of frost. Snow crystals shimmer briefly through darkness before vanishing again into the storm. Beautiful and deeply dangerous. Several contemporary accounts describe the blizzard nights as strangely mesmerizing despite the hardship. Some survivors later admitted the storm transformed ordinary Manhattan into something almost theatrical, like wandering through a frozen dreamscape. You pause outside a boarding house crowded with stranded travelers. Voices drift through the doorway each time someone enters or leaves. Laughter appears occasionally too. That surprises you at first. But humour survives nearly everything. Inside, people share rumours, food blankets, and stories simply to pass time, while the storm rages beyond the walls. Complete silence would feel worse. You smell coffee and pipe tobacco strongly here. A woman near the stove reads aloud from an old newspaper, while several listeners knit smoke or doze beside the fire. One exhausted labourer sleeps sitting upright against the wall with his cap pulled low across his eyes. His boots still drip melted snow onto the floorboards. A practical reality of the blizzard involves simple overcrowding. Hotels, saloons, boarding houses, churches and restaurants filled beyond normal capacity because thousands became trapped far from home. Privacy disappeared quickly during those days. Warmth mattered more. You move onward again after thawing your hands briefly near the stove. The wind softens for several minutes outside, though snow still falls steadily. Without the strongest gusts, the city sounds different now. Quieter. Almost hollow. You hear distant shovels scraping packed snow. Somewhere nearby, a horse stamps nervously inside a stable. Window shutters creak faintly in the cold. Otherwise, Manhattan remains eerily still. Researchers examining diaries from March 1888 continue disagreeing about how isolated residents truly felt psychologically during the storm. Some accounts describe intense fear and loneliness. Others portray neighborhoods becoming unusually social as strangers relied upon one another. Probably both experiences existed simultaneously. Human reactions rarely fit neatly together. You cross an intersection where workers attempt clearing a buried telegraph pole from the street. Ice coats the wood so thickly that lantern light reflects blue across its surface. Nearby cables lie tangled beneath drifting snow like frozen vines. One worker jokes bitterly that pigeons might replace telegraphs by morning. He laughs very hard. The cold deepens steadily tonight. Your cheeks burn painfully now whenever exposed to wind. Breathing through the scarf creates thin layers of ice across the fabric again. You flex stiff fingers repeatedly inside damp gloves. Ahead, a church opens its heavy doors to travellers. Warm candlelight spills across the snow outside. Several families hurry inward, carrying bundles, blankets, and sleepy children wrapped in thick coats. That sight feels comforting somehow. During disasters, ordinary buildings often reveal unexpected purposes. Churches become shelters, restaurants become relief stations, stables become warming rooms. Even newspaper offices sometimes house stranded pedestrians overnight. The city improvises survival. You glance upward one final time toward the damaged telegraph line stretching into darkness above Manhattan. Snow gathers steadily across every wire while frozen wind hums through the broken network. America still exists beyond the storm tonight. Boston, Philadelphia, Washington. But New York cannot hear them anymore, and beneath the endless falling snow, the great city settles deeper into a strange frozen silence, where even information itself struggles to move. By the third morning, parts of New York no longer look inhabited. You step outside your boarding house and stop immediately beside the doorway. Snow towers above your shoulders on both sides of the narrow trench leading toward the street. During the night, drifting snow swallowed nearly everything beyond the first floor of nearby buildings. The city feels buried alive. Wind still moves across Manhattan, though less violently than before. It carries loose snow through the air in soft white streams that twist around chimneys and lampposts. The silence feels heavier now too. Not peaceful, muted. You begin walking carefully through pathways carved by shovel crews before dawn. Packed snow squeaks sharply beneath your boots with each step. The sound repeats rhythmically through the frozen streets where ordinary traffic remains almost non-existent. Ahead, several men stand staring at what used to be a storefront entrance. Only the upper half of the door remains visible now. Snowdrifts pile so high against certain buildings that residents climb directly from second-story windows onto packed snowbanks outside. Children seem fascinated by this strange transformation. Adults appear less enthusiastic. A surviving city report later described drifts reaching more than 30 feet high in exposed areas where wind continuously piled snow against structures and elevated tracks. The measurements varied greatly depending upon location, though nearly every account agrees the accumulation looked astonishing. You turn onto a broader avenue slowly. The view stops you cold. The street resembles a frozen canyon. Huge ridges of snow stretch across the avenue in uneven walls shaped by powerful gusts. Buried wagons protrude from the drifts like shipwrecks trapped in ice. Only the tops of certain fences and signs remain visible. A gas lamp emerges from one drift at a strange angle. Its lower half disappeared entirely overnight. The air smells cleaner today in some ways. Fresh snow covers the usual layers of mud manure and refuse that normally define city streets, yet smoke still hangs everywhere from overworked furnaces and coal fires. That scent never leaves completely. You pass a bakery where workers tunnel directly through the snow toward the entrance. Steam pours from the open doorway, carrying the warm smell of bread into the freezing morning air. People gather there quietly, holding baskets and cloth sacks. Food matters more with each passing day. Several supply wagons remain trapped outside the city, and many shops already ration basic goods carefully. Bread milk, coal, candles, and kerosene become especially valuable during long storms. One woman near the bakery whispers nervously about running low on firewood. Another offers to share extra coal if necessary. Moments like this appear throughout Manhattan now. Neighbors who barely spoke before the storm suddenly exchange supplies and information like family members. Disasters rearrange social habits quickly. You continue onward while workers shovel narrow passages across buried intersections. Their faces appear grey with exhaustion beneath wool caps coated in frost. Some crews work nearly non-stop, rotating between digging, warming indoors briefly, then returning outside again. The labour never seems finished. Fresh wind pushes loose snow back into cleared paths almost immediately. A curious account from the period tells of adventurous young boys tunneling directly through drifts for amusement, creating little snow chambers and passageways between buried fences. Parents naturally hated this idea after several close calls involving collapsing snowbanks. Children truly possess astonishing confidence. You stop near an apartment building where residents lower buckets from upper windows using rope lines. Men below fill them with coal and groceries before neighbours haul the supplies back upward. The entire system looks strangely efficient. Necessity encourages creativity. A medical observer writing after the storm noted that many injuries occurred not during the heaviest snowfall but afterward, while residents attempted climbing unstable drifts or clearing rooftops overloaded with packed snow and ice. That danger surrounds you constantly now. Icicles hang from gutters like glass knives. Snow slides unexpectedly from roofs. Buried cellar doors create hidden traps beneath uneven drifts. You move cautiously beside a line of labourers dragging a large sled through the avenue. The sled carries sacks of flour covered beneath canvas sheets. Horses cannot manage this section properly, so human strength replaces animal power. The men breathe heavily together. Steam rises around them in thick clouds. Their boots sink deeply with every pull, yet nobody stops. A city this large still requires feeding regardless of weather. You hear church bells somewhere uptown again. The sound travels strangely through the snow-packed streets, softer than usual. Almost distant enough to imagine rather than hear clearly. Several pedestrians nearby pause briefly to listen. Then they continue digging, hauling, carrying, surviving. Scholars examining storm records continue debating the exact emotional atmosphere across New York during these days. Newspaper accounts often exaggerated heroism dramatically, while private diaries sometimes described fear, frustration, and exhaustion in much quieter detail. Reality likely blended all those emotions together. Human experience rarely stays simple during catastrophe. You pass a group of policemen helping recover a buried street sign near the next intersection. One officer laughs weakly after discovering the sign almost completely encased in ice. Nobody seems certain whether humor helps or merely distracts. Probably both. The cold remains relentless despite calmer winds. Your boots feel stiff with frozen moisture. Fingers ache inside damp gloves even after repeated movement. Every exposed patch of skin burns sharply after only minutes outdoors. Yet people continue appearing everywhere. Shopkeepers clearing entrances, children carrying soup, stable workers brushing exhausted horses. Women shaking snow from blankets through upper windows, men chopping paths toward buried pumps and coal sheds. The city refuses surrender. You finally reach a slightly elevated section overlooking part of the avenue below. From there, Manhattan stretches outward beneath endless white drifts and pale winter smoke. The view feels almost unreal. Familiar neighborhoods appear transformed into frozen landscapes shaped more by wind than human design. Rooftops blend into streets. Chimneys rise like dark islands from white oceans of snow, and still the storm leaves reminders everywhere. Loose snow spirals through the air, ice cracks faintly overhead. Distant shovels scrape endlessly against packed drifts. You stand quietly for a moment, breathing coal smoke and freezing air while staring across the buried city. Somewhere beneath those enormous snowbanks lie trolley tracks. Cobblestones, storefronts, sidewalks, and ordinary life waiting patiently to emerge again. But for now, New York belongs to the snow. The policemen look like moving snowdrifts. You spot them first through swirling white haze near a buried intersection downtown. Their dark uniforms have nearly vanished beneath layers of frost and packed snow. Only brass buttons and swinging lanterns separate them from the storm itself. Still they keep walking, hour after hour. You follow one patrol slowly through the narrow trench carved between towering drifts. The officer moves carefully while gripping a long wooden staff to test hidden ground beneath the snow. That precaution matters. Cellar doors hide everywhere below the drifts now. One careless step could send a person plunging into icy darkness beneath the street. The officer's boots crunch heavily against packed snow. Ice coats the edges of his beard. Every few minutes he pauses to shout toward nearby buildings. Anybody stranded inside. His voice disappears quickly into the cold air. The police force in 1888 lacked modern emergency equipment radios or motorized vehicles. During the blizzard, most officers relied entirely upon foot patrols, memory of local streets, and stubborn endurance while conducting rescues across buried neighborhoods. You smell kerosene from the officer's lantern as you move closer. The scent mixes with coal smoke drifting between buildings and the bitter sharpness of frozen air. Somewhere nearby, someone cooks onions over a stove. Even through the storm, the smell reaches the street briefly before fading again. A second officer emerges from the white haze ahead. Together they guide an elderly man through knee-deep snow toward a church shelter several blocks away. The old man shivers violently beneath blankets wrapped around his shoulders. His shoes appear soaked through. That alone could become fatal in this weather. Accounts written after the storm often praised ordinary policemen for risking their lives repeatedly during rescue attempts. Many officers worked continuously for days with little sleep while navigating impossible conditions. You turn another corner beside the patrol. The wind strengthens suddenly, there whipping loose snow through the avenue in twisting clouds. Visibility shrinks almost instantly. Buildings fade behind pale curtains of ice and blowing powder. One officer reaches for a rope line tied between lampposts. Without it, navigation becomes difficult even for experienced locals. Some patrols created temporary guide ropes across dangerous intersections and exposed streets to prevent pedestrians from wandering into deep drifts or waterfront areas. Honestly, it sounds terrifying. The storm changes familiar places into traps. You pass a partially buried saloon glowing warmly through frosted windows. Several stranded residents crowd inside beside smoky lamps while a bartender serves coffee and stew instead of stronger drinks. Probably a wise decision. Outside the entrance, a policeman stomps snow from his boots before stepping indoors briefly to warm his hands. Steam rises from his coat immediately upon entering. The contrast feels shocking every time. Frozen streets, overheated interiors, then frozen streets again. Your own cheeks ache sharply after another blast of wind sweeps across the avenue. You pull your scarf higher while following the officers toward the waterfront district. The smell changes gradually there. Less bread and chimney smoke. More salt water and frozen wood. The harbour remains mostly hidden beneath the drifting snow, but you can hear distant ice grinding faintly against dock pilings somewhere beyond the warehouses. One overlooked detail from surviving reports mentions that policemen sometimes carried small flasks of hot coffee beneath their coats during extended patrols. The drinks cooled quickly anyway, but even lukewarm coffee offered comfort during endless hours outdoors. Small comforts matter enormously now. A head shouting erupts near a snowbank almost as tall as a carriage. Several men dig frantically beside the drift while 2 officers direct the effort. A woman trapped inside a buried cab still waits there. You move closer carefully. Only the upper portion of the cab remains visible above packed snow. The horse disappeared earlier after breaking free from the harness. Workers shovel rapidly while snow sprays through the freezing air around them. The trapped passenger finally emerges pale and trembling beneath heavy blankets. Everyone exhales together. No cheering follows. People seem too tired for that now. You continue onward beside the patrol as daylight fades weakly through thick clouds overhead. The city never fully brightens during storms like this. Sunlight arrives filtered through layers of snow, smoke and ice until everything appears dim and grey. A memory from earlier returns suddenly. The crowded streetcars, the shouting drivers, the ordinary busy city before the blizzard swallowed it whole. That world already feels distant. Several children wave from an upper apartment window as the policemen pass below. One officer tips his cap politely despite exhaustion. Ice cracks faintly from the brim during the movement. A surviving diary from the period described policemen knocking on doors throughout poorer neighbourhoods simply to ensure isolated residents remained alive and warm enough to survive the night. That quiet work rarely appears in grand historic chronicling. Yet it saved lives. You reach a narrow alley where drifting snow nearly blocks passage entirely. The officers pause while deciding whether anyone could realistically remain trapped farther inside. Then they hear banging, faint, rhythmic. Immediately both men force themselves into the drift. Snow pushes against their chests while lantern light bounces wildly across buried walls and doorways. You wait near the entrance, listening. The wind softens briefly. For several moments the city sounds strangely still again. No wagon wheels, no train whistles, no market crowds, only distant shovels. Then voices return from inside the alley. The officers emerge helping a young delivery worker barely able to walk. His face looks frighteningly pale beneath layers of snow and frozen fabric. The smell of whiskey drifts from one officer as he pours a small amount into the young man's mouth. Not enough for drunkenness, just enough to steady him before the journey toward a shelter. There remains disagreement among some historians about how coordinated rescue efforts truly were during the worst storm conditions. Certain accounts portray organised patrol systems, while others suggest much of the life-saving work depended upon individual initiative and neighbourhood cooperation. Probably both versions contain truth. Disasters often create messy heroism. Night approaches once more across Manhattan. Gas lamps flicker alive through swirling snow while the policemen continue their endless march between buried buildings and frozen streets. You follow them a little farther through the growing darkness. Their lanterns sway gently ahead, small moving lights against the storm. The grand hotels glow like islands against the storm. After hours outside in the frozen streets, you notice their windows immediately. Warm golden light spills through thick curtains onto buried sidewalks where snow continues drifting in pale waves. You push toward one entrance carefully. A doorman wrapped in a heavy wool coat struggles to keep the revolving door moving against packed snow. Every time the entrance opens, icy wind sweeps into the lobby, carrying powdered snow across polished floors. Inside feels like another world entirely. The air smells richly of cigar smoke, perfume, roasted meat, and burning coal. Crystal chandeliers shimmer overhead while soaked travellers crowd beneath enormous carpets and velvet drapes. The contrast almost feels absurd. Outside, men shovel paths through waist-deep drifts. Inside, a pianist still plays softly near the dining room. Not perfectly, though. You notice his hands trembling slightly from exhaustion. The hotel lobby overflows with stranded guests tonight. Wealthy businessmen sit beside exhausted labourers. Travellers share sofas with families unable to reach home. Wet boots line the marble entrance while servants carry endless buckets of coal toward roaring fireplaces. Disaster softens social boundaries in curious ways. Not completely, but enough to notice. One surviving newspaper account described luxury hotels during the blizzard as temporary villages where strangers slept across parlours, hallways and dining rooms simply because no safer options remained. You remove your gloves slowly near the fire. Pain rushes back into your fingers immediately. Nearby guests hold cups of steaming coffee and broth while waiters weave carefully through the crowded room, balancing trays above sleeping travellers. The smell of fresh bread drifts from the kitchen. That scent alone relaxes people visibly. Food supplies inside the grand hotels remain better than most ordinary boarding houses or tenements. Wealthier establishments stored larger quantities of cauliflower, preserved meat, wine, candles, and linens before winter storms. Preparation mattered, especially in 19th century cities where transportation disruptions quickly interrupted deliveries. You glance toward the front desk where anxious guests question clerks about train schedules and telegraph updates. The clerks answer politely, though most information remains uncertain. Nobody knows exactly when transportation will recover. A curious detail recalled years later involved wealthy hotel guests paying enormous tips for simple necessity during the storm. Dry socks, extra blankets, hot shaving water, or fresh bread suddenly carried almost absurd value once the city became trapped beneath snow. Civilization depends heavily upon tiny comforts. You settle briefly beside a massive fireplace near several other stranded residents. The heat feels almost overwhelming after the brutal cold outside. Your damp coat begins steaming immediately. A woman nearby dries gloves beside the flames while reading aloud from a newspaper several days old. Since communication lines remain unreliable, even outdated news attracts attention now. People crave information constantly, even incomplete information. A number of period writers observed that hotel lobbies became unofficial rumor exchanges during the blizzard. Stories travelled from traveller to traveller faster than verified reports. One guest claimed the harbour froze solid. Another insisted wolves wandered through northern suburbs. The wolves almost certainly did not appear. At least probably not. You study the room quietly while snow rattles faintly against the tall windows. Wealthy ladies wrapped in furs sip tea beside exhausted salesmen sleeping upright in armchairs. A child builds tiny snow figures from melted clumps brought indoors on boots. Near the staircase, several musicians attempt cheerful conversation with stranded theatre performers unable to reach Brooklyn performances. One actor dramatically predicts civilization has ended entirely. A waiter replies that civilization would still owe him wages afterward. That earns the first real laughter you have heard all day. The hotel staff never stops moving. Bellboys carry luggage. Maids distribute blankets. Kitchen workers haul steaming pots through crowded corridors. Coal stokers disappear constantly toward debasement furnaces, keeping the building alive against the freezing storm outside. Without those workers, luxury would collapse within hours. You notice the scent of damp wool everywhere beneath the richer smells of perfume and tobacco. No matter how elegant the hotel appears, hundreds of snow-soaked guests still crowd its halls tonight. Wet winter clothing always announces itself. Researchers examining social responses during the blizzard continue discussing whether wealthy districts recovered faster than poorer neighbourhoods. Access to cold food reserves, medical care and secure shelter certainly varied across class lines, though the storm disrupted life for nearly everyone regardless of income. Snow ignores social status surprisingly well. You wander toward one of the dining rooms where stranded guests gather around long tables beneath gas chandeliers. Dinner service continues in reduced form despite supply concerns. Soup dominates the menu tonight. Simple, hot, reliable. Steam rises from bowls while exhausted travellers eat quietly beside strangers they met only hours earlier. Silverware clinks softly against china. Outside the windows, wind drives snow across the darkened avenue in endless white ribbons. The storm feels farther away indoors, not gone, just distant. One overlooked memory preserved in a personal letter described hotel guests pressing coins into servants' hands simply to hear fresh street news from outside. Information became entertainment, reassurance, and warning all at once during those isolated days. You overhear fragments of conversation drifting between tables. Elevated trains remain stalled. Brooklyn ferries struggle through ice. Several theatres close indefinitely. Milk shortages worsen downtown. Nobody discusses ordinary business matters anymore. The storm consumes every conversation like weather swallowing the city itself. Eventually you move toward an upstairs hallway crowded with temporary bedding. Hotel staff converted parlours and meeting rooms into sleeping spaces for stranded travellers. Rows of blankets cover carpets beneath dim lamps. The atmosphere feels oddly peaceful there. Soft snoring, crackling fireplaces, muted conversation, people wrapped in coats and quilts resting wherever space allows. Even disasters require sleep eventually. There remains uncertainty among modern historians regarding exactly how many individuals sought emergency shelter inside New York hotels during the blizzard. Records from some establishments disappeared or remained incomplete, leaving only scattered newspaper descriptions and diary references. Still, the scale appears enormous. You pause beside a tall window before settling down for the night. Outside Manhattan still lies buried beneath snowdrifts glowing faintly beneath gas lamps. The storm continues whispering against the glass, but inside the hotel warmth, light and human voices hold the darkness back for a little while longer. Far downtown beyond the grand hotels and polished lobbies, another kind of survival unfolds quietly inside the tenements. You leave the warmth of Midtown behind and move toward narrower streets packed tightly with brick apartment buildings. Snow still covers everything, but here the storm feels heavier somehow. Closer, more personal. The avenues shrink into cramped corridors between towering walls of dark windows and smoking chimneys. Laundry lines hang frozen solid above buried alleys. Snowdrifts block cellar entrances completely. You smell coal and mean. Immediately. Strong, thick, mixed with cabbage soup, damp wood, kerosene, and too many people sharing too little space. The tenements of 19th century New York already carried difficult living conditions before the blizzard arrived. Entire families often crowded into tiny apartments with limited heat-poor ventilation and shared water sources. During severe storms, those hardships intensified quickly. You climb a narrow staircase inside one crowded building. The hallway feels warmer than outdoors, but far from comfortable. Moisture drips from melting snow tracked across wooden steps. Children's voices echo faintly behind thin apartment doors, while somewhere nearby, a baby cries endlessly. Inside one apartment, 6 people gather around a cast-iron stove. The room glows softly from firelight and kerosene lamps. Blankets hang across doorways to trap heat. Pots simmer slowly atop the stove while boots dry near the flames. Everyone stays close together. Body warmth matters now. A woman stirs soup carefully while her husband chips ice from a water bucket near the window. 2 older boys sleep beneath coats piled across a mattress on the floor. The air smells crowded. Soup broth, wet wool, smoke, human breath. Yet there is comfort here too. Shared hardship creates its own atmosphere. People speak softly, someone hums a tune from the old country, while another patches torn gloves beside the fire. One recollection written years later described immigrant neighborhoods during the blizzard as places where neighbors passed food directly through windows and hallways whenever streets became too dangerous to cross. That kind of generosity rarely appears in official city reports. You sit quietly near the stove while wind rattles the building outside. Snow taps softly against the windows now rather than roaring. The worst of the storm has begun weakening, though freezing cold still grips the city tightly. A young girl offers you black bread without hesitation. You thank her gently. The bread tastes dense and slightly sour, but wonderfully warm from the stove nearby. Simple meals stretch farther in crowded households. Soup thickened with potatoes, onions, cabbage, and scraps of meat becomes both dinner and survival strategy. Nothing gets wasted. Another apartment upstairs houses 3 unrelated families sharing rooms together after becoming stranded during the storm. Mattresses line the floors beneath hanging coats and drying scarves. Men returning from snow clearing work sit exhausted beside steaming teacups. Their hands look raw from cold. A detail mentioned in several neighborhood accounts describes residents using newspapers, old fabric, and even straw to block drafts around windows and doors during the blizzard. Keeping warmth inside mattered almost as much as generating heat itself. You hear arguments occasionally too. Stress builds quickly in crowded rooms. Children grow restless. Coal supplies run low. Tempers flare over noise, food, and sleeping space. Survival rarely appears graceful up close. Still people endure together. You return outside briefly through the narrow tenement entrance. The street beyond remains buried beneath deep snow, though pathways now crisscross between buildings, where residents carved routes manually. Laundry poles stick from drifts at strange angles. A buried wagon wheel protrudes near the corner like a frozen relic. Several women stand outside exchanging supplies, wrapped in cloth bundles. One carries potatoes. Another balances a pail of soup beneath thick blankets to preserve warmth during the walk. Conversation travels quickly through these streets. Who needs coal? Who has medicine? Who remains missing? Who found work clearing snow for the city? The blizzard isolates Manhattan from the outside world. Yet inside these neighborhoods, communication never fully stops. It simply changes form. A surprisingly charming story from the period tells of children using snow tunnels between neighboring buildings to deliver bread and messages while adults remained indoors. Parents worried constantly about collapsing drifts, though the children apparently considered the entire arrangement thrilling. Children continue finding adventure where adults find exhaustion. You enter another building where the stairwell smells strongly of onions frying in lard. Somewhere above, someone plays a violin softly enough that the melody drifts almost dreamlike through the cramped hallways. Music survives disasters too. Inside a third-floor apartment, an elderly couple sits wrapped in blankets beside a tiny stove barely strong enough to heat the room. Frost still clings to portions of the walls near the windows. The old man coughs heavily into a cloth. Medical care remains difficult to access during the storm. Doctors cannot easily travel, and many poorer residents avoid calling them anyway because treatment costs money few families possess. Several modern researchers continue examining how immigrant communities relied upon informal support networks during the blizzard rather than official municipal aid. Churches, mutual aid societies, extended relatives, and neighborhood businesses often became the real foundation of survival. The city government alone could not handle everything. You descend back toward the street as evening settles once again over Manhattan. Lamps glow warmly behind frosted windows while smoke curls upward from crowded chimneys into the pale winter sky. The storm no longer dominates every sound now. Instead, you hear smaller things returning. Voices, footsteps, cooking pots, laughter from somewhere upstairs. A woman singing softly to calm a restless child. The city begins breathing again little by little. Not fully recovered, not comfortable, but alive. You pause near the end of the block, watching snow fall gently through dim gaslight onto the crowded tenement roofs. Families gather behind those windows, sharing soup blankets, stories, worries, and warmth, while frozen Manhattan slowly waits for spring to remember it again. The newsboys return before the city fully recovers. You spot them weaving through snow-packed streets at dawn, their small figures wrapped in oversized coats stiff with frozen slush. Bundles of newspapers rest beneath their arms while they shout headlines into the bitter morning air. Their voices crack from cold. Still they keep shouting. The streets remain buried beneath enormous drifts, yet the city hungers for information, almost as desperately as it needs coal and bread. Every fresh newspaper promises updates about missing relatives, railway closures, deaths, rescues, and rumors spreading across the Northeast. You follow one boy along Broadway. He cannot be older than 12. Snow reaches nearly to his knees in certain places, forcing him to climb over frozen ridges instead of walking around them. Each breath escapes his scarf in pale clouds while melting snow drips steadily from the brim of his cap. Extra papers. Blizzard. Choose. The cry echoes between buildings coated in ice. Newsboys formed an essential part of New York street life during the late 19th century. Most purchased newspapers cheaply before reselling them individually for small profits. During disasters, their work became even more dangerous, because severe weather never stopped public demand for headlines. The boy pauses beside a coffee stand crowded with laborers. Immediately, several men reach for papers despite numb fingers and wet gloves. Steam rises from tin cups while readers scan headlines beneath weak winter sunlight filtering through cloud cover. The papers smell strongly of fresh ink. That scent mixes with coffee grounds, cigar smoke, and freezing air drifting across the avenue. Nearby, a horse shakes snow violently from its mane while workers clear another buried street crossing. The entire city still sounds tired. Shovels scrape constantly, wheels grind slowly, voices remain softer than usual. One resident later remembered that newspapers during the blizzard often arrived damp, partially frozen or delayed by many hours, yet people still treated each edition like precious cargo. Information carried warmth somehow. Reassurance too. You purchase a paper from the young seller and unfold it carefully beside a gas lamp. The pages tremble slightly in the wind. Headlines describe stalled trains, collapsed telegraph lines, heroic rescues and snowdrifts towering across Manhattan. Some details feel exaggerated. Others probably understate the reality entirely. 19th century newspapers thrived on dramatic language. Editors competed fiercely for readers, especially during disasters. Storm coverage often mixed factual reporting with emotional storytelling and bold speculation. Honestly, modern headlines behave similarly sometimes. You continue walking while the boy hurries ahead towards another cluster of pedestrians. His boots leave shallow tracks through packed snow, already blackened by soot and horse traffic. The city slowly regains movement now. Not normal movement, careful movement. Men pull sleds instead of wagons across certain streets. Temporary footpaths snake between snowbanks taller than doorways. Storekeepers shovel entrances repeatedly while children climb frozen piles like miniature mountains. A smaller newsboy suddenly appears from an alley, carrying papers nearly half his own size. He slips immediately on packed ice, scattering newspapers across the drifted sidewalk. Several strangers help gather them without hesitation. Nobody laughs. The younger boy mutters embarrassed thanks before racing onward again through the cold. A forgotten newspaper anecdote from the storm involved boys sleeping directly inside printing offices because conditions made returning home impossible. Printers, delivery workers, and young sellers sometimes remained awake nearly all night, waiting for fresh editions. The newspaper business never truly rested. You stop beside one printing building where fresh editions emerge through side doors carried by exhausted workers stained with ink and coal dust. The machinery inside rattles endlessly. The smell pouring from the doorway feels overwhelming. Hot metal, oil, ink, wet paper, steam heat. Compared to the frozen streets, the printing room resembles a furnace. Inside, men feed giant presses while editors argue over incoming reports from damaged telegraph lines. Messengers stomp melted snow across the floorboards carrying handwritten updates gathered from police stations and harbour offices. Accuracy becomes difficult during storms. Speed matters more. One editor curses loudly after learning another telegraph line failed overnight. Printer replies that readers probably expect confusion by now anyway. Fair point. Outside again, you watch several newsboys warming their hands above a street vendor's coal brazier. Their cheeks glow red from cold exposure. One tears pieces from a loaf of bread, while another proudly recounts seeing a stranded train buried almost completely beneath snow. Whether the story grows larger with each retelling remains uncertain. Children often improve reality for dramatic effect. Researchers studying urban labour during the blizzard continue debating how many working children remained active throughout the storm. Official records rarely documented them carefully, especially among poorer immigrant districts where informal labour remained common. Yet eyewitness reports mention them constantly. Selling papers, carrying food, running meth, helping shovel snow. The city depended upon them more than polite society preferred admitting. You continue downtown while sunlight briefly strengthens overhead. The snow sparkles almost beautifully now beneath pale winter brightness. Ice hanging from rooftops flashes silver above buried sidewalks. Then a freezing gust sweeps across the avenue again. Beauty disappears instantly beneath raw cold. Several newsboys tuck newspapers beneath their coats to protect them from blowing snow. Damp papers tear easily, and ruined copies mean lost income. Every penny matters for children supporting families through difficult winters. You hear headlines shouted repeatedly through the streets. Storm casualties. Railroads blocked. City paralyzed. The words bounce across Manhattan like fragments of some enormous shared conversation. Even residents who never buy papers still pause to listen. Because everyone wants answers. How long will this continue? Who survived? What happens next? You stop beside the harbour railings where icy wind rushes inland, carrying the sharp scent of salt water and frozen docks. Snow still covers much of the waterfront, though workers already attempt reopening pathways through the drifts. Nearby, a newsboy stands upon an overturned crate shouting headlines toward passing labourers. His voice sounds exhausted but determined. Behind him, Manhattan slowly stirs awake beneath smoke, snow, and weak winter sunlight. And through every buried street in the recovering city, the newsboys keep moving, carrying stories through the cold long before comfort properly returns. The waterfront smells different after the storm. You notice it before reaching the docks themselves. The usual odour of fish tar, salt water, and coal smoke now carries an added sharpness from frozen seawater and shattered ice. The harbour feels wounded. You move carefully downhill toward the East River, where snow-packed streets slope between warehouses coated in frost. Wind still sweeps inland from the water, colder here than anywhere else in Manhattan. Your scarf stiffens almost immediately again. Dock workers emerge slowly through the drifting haze, carrying shovels, ropes, and lanterns. Most walk with heavy exhaustion in their shoulders. Some have barely slept since the blizzard began. Ships remain trapped throughout portions of the harbour. Ferries move cautiously through floating ice when conditions allow. Smaller vessels sit frozen against piers beneath thick layers of snow. The waterfront sounds strangely hollow now. No busy shouting, no constant cargo unloading, no roaring traffic from incoming ferries, only distant hammering and the soft cracking of ice against wooden pilings. Several contemporary newspaper descriptions portrayed the harbour after the storm as almost ghostly compared to its usual chaos. For one of the busiest ports in America to fall, this quiet felt deeply unsettling to residents. New York depended upon motion. The docks embodied that motion more than anywhere else. You pass stacks of frozen barrels half buried beside a warehouse entrance. Men chip ice from ropes and pulleys using short iron tools while another crew struggles freeing a wagon wheel trapped beneath hardened snow. Their breath hangs thick in the air. So does their frustration. One labourer mutters that spring may arrive before certain cargo shipments do. Another replies that the city will probably eat the horses first. Dark humour survives especially well among exhausted workers. The smell near the river intensifies. Salt water, wet rope, fish, frozen wood, coal ash blowing from steam vessels farther offshore. The cold air sharpens every scent until each one feels almost separate from the others. You step onto a partially cleared pier carefully. Snow crunches beneath your boots while icy wind whips across the open water hard enough to sting your eyes. The river itself looks dangerous. Grey ice floats between darker channels of moving water, while tugboats struggle slowly through narrow openings. Their whistles echo mournfully across the harbour. One longshoreman points toward Brooklyn through the haze. Could barely see the ferries 3 days ago, he says. Now outlines of distant buildings emerge faintly through drifting snow and smoke. The city slowly reconnects with itself. An often forgotten detail from the blizzard involves how many waterfront workers remained stranded directly at the docks during the storm. Some slept inside warehouses or aboard ships because travelling home became impossible once conditions collapsed. You enter one warehouse seeking warmth. Inside, lantern. Light glows across towering stacks of crates and barrels. The air smells heavily of coffee beans, damp burlap tobacco, and seawater trapped in old wood. Several workers gather around a small stove drinking black coffee from tin cups. Nobody speaks, Lou. Fatigue settles over the room like another layer of dust. A cook near the back heats stew inside an enormous pot blackened from years of use. The broth smells rich with onions and salted beef. Men line up quietly holding battered bowls and pieces of bread. Simple meals feel sacred. One dock worker removes his gloves, slowly revealing cracked skin along his fingers from constant exposure to cold water and frozen rope. Another man rubs his shoulders painfully before returning outside toward the piers. The harbour never truly rests for long, even after catastrophe. City records from the era reveal how severely the blizzard disrupted shipping schedules along the eastern seaboard. Cargo delays affected food supplies, coal deliveries, manufacturing schedules, and communication between major ports. The storm touched nearly every industry connected to the water. You leave the warehouse and continue farther along the waterfront. Snow still drifts heavily against certain piers where wind funnels between buildings. Several sections remain too dangerous for regular work because ice coats the planks unevenly. A gull cries overhead suddenly. The sound feels oddly comforting after days dominated by wind. Life returns in tiny pieces first. Birds, footsteps, voices. Then larger movements follow. Near one dock, a small crowd gathers around a ferry captain recounting his experience during the worst night of the blizzard. He gestures dramatically toward the river, while listeners shake their heads in disbelief. According to his version, waves froze directly onto the vessel's railings, while visibility vanished completely for hours. Perhaps he exaggerates slightly, perhaps not. Storm memories tend to grow sharper with reading. You watch labourers unload supplies with ticket from a newly arrived vessel farther down the pier. The work proceeds swiftly because snow and ice cover every surface. Men pass crates hand to hand while others clear pathways through frozen slush. The smell of oranges suddenly drifts through the cold air from one open shipment. Bright, fresh, unexpected. After days surrounded by coal smoke and wet wool, even the scent of fruit feels almost luxurious. A rumour circulated after the storm claiming that desperate dock workers traded expensive cigars simply for fresh lemons and oranges once certain food deliveries stalled. Whether fully true or not, shortages definitely change the value of ordinary goods. Cold weather reshapes priorities quickly. You pause beside the railing overlooking the icy harbour. Weak sunlight breaks briefly through heavy clouds, turning portions of the river silver beneath drifting smoke. The view feels enormous. Cold wind presses against your coat while ferries creep cautiously between floating ice beyond the docks. Somewhere across the water, Brooklyn continues digging itself free from the same storm. Behind you, Manhattan slowly awakens again. Not healed, not restored, but moving, and along the frozen waterfront where silence once settled heavily. After the blizzard, the harbour workers keep lifting, hauling, clearing, cooking, repairing and enduring. Beside the restless winter sea, the rumours begin quietly. You first hear them inside a crowded bakery where exhausted customers wait beside shelves half empty from days of disrupted deliveries. Snow still clings to everyone's coats while warm bread scents drift heavily through the cramped room. A woman near the stove lowers her voice carefully. She claims the storm arrived after strange lights appeared above the harbour the previous week. Another customer immediately crosses himself. Nobody fully believes the story, yet nobody dismisses it entirely either. Disasters create fertile ground for superstition. During the 19th century, many New Yorkers balanced modern science with older beliefs carried from Europe, rural villages, sailor traditions, and family folklore. Storms especially encouraged imagination. You step back outside carrying fresh bread wrapped in cloth. The morning air bites sharply against your face, though the winds have weakened considerably now. The city still looks a frozen solid. Snowbanks tower beside narrow pathways carved between buildings. Icicles hang from rooftops like rows of glass daggers catching pale winter light. A group of labourers nearby discusses another rumour. Someone supposedly predicted the blizzard days beforehand using animal behaviour and moon patterns. According to the story, barn cats hid beneath furniture while seabirds abandoned the harbour unusually early. Whether true or not, people repeat the tale eagerly. Humans enjoy believing somebody saw disaster coming. You continue through lower Manhattan while church bells echo softly across the cold air. More residents fill the streets now, carrying coal buckets, groceries and newspapers beneath thick scarves and heavy coats. The city sounds alive again, slowly, carefully. A bookseller standing outside his shop mentions that some residents blame the blizzard on unusual solar activity reported in scientific journals weeks earlier. Others insisted volcanic eruptions somewhere overseas disturbed the atmosphere. 19th century, weather science remained developing territory. Meteorologists understood storms far better than previous generations, yet enormous gaps still existed in forecasting and atmospheric knowledge. When explanations fail, speculation rushes in quickly. You pause beside a narrow alley where children build strange snow figures against a brick wall. One child insists the figures protect the neighborhood from another storm arriving before spring. The others seem uncertain. Still, they continue shaping the snow carefully. An unusual newspaper column published shortly after the blizzard described residents hanging horseshoes and small religious charms near windows during the storm's worst nights. Such customs varied widely between immigrant communities and family traditions. Fear encourages old habits to return. You enter a small tavern seeking warmth. Inside, conversation drifts heavily towards stories instead of facts. Men huddle near the stove sipping coffee while melting snow pools beneath their boots. The room smells strongly of tobacco smoke and wet wool. A sailor near the corner swears he heard phantom church bells ringing through the harbour fog during the height of the blizzard, despite nearby churches standing closed and buried beneath snow. Another listener insists wandering spirits always accompany severe winter storms. The bartender rolls his eyes dramatically, yet he listens too. Outside, pale sunlight reflects across buried streets almost painfully bright after days of grey skies. Snow crunches sharply beneath your boots as you continue toward a crowded market district reopening little by little. Vendors return cautiously. Some sell potatoes. Others offer onions, bread, or salted meat from partially restored deliveries. Several women whisper together about dreams predicting another freeze before month's end. One claims her grandmother always trusted dreams involving frozen rivers. No one laughs openly at her. Hard winters soften skepticism. Letters written after the storm reveal how quickly folklore circulated through crowded neighborhoods once normal communication failed. Without reliable news, personal stories and traditional beliefs often spread faster than verified information. People searched for meaning everywhere. You pass a church where candles flicker behind stained glass windows darkened by soot and frost. Several residents kneel quietly inside despite the afternoon hour. Prayer increases during disasters, not always from deep faith, sometimes simply from uncertainty. The church smells faintly of wax-damp coats and old wood warmed by struggling furnaces. A priest speaks softly near the altar while snowmelt drips steadily from boots lined beside the entrance. Outside again the city glimmers beneath winter sunlight, beautiful in dangerous ways. The blizzard left Manhattan transformed into something almost theatrical. Snow softens harsh edges. Chimney smoke curls upward through pale blue skies while frozen rooftops shine silver across the avenues. Then you notice the silence lingering underneath. Not complete silence anymore, but caution. A strange hesitation remains within the city after enduring so much cold and isolation. One particularly colourful rumour spread through parts of New York claimed that certain telegraph lines continued clicking mysteriously after being disconnected by the storm. Some residents interpreted the sounds as ghost messages travelling through frozen wires. Most likely the noises came from shifting ice and damaged equipment. Still, the story survived for years afterward. You stop beside an elderly street vendor warming chestnuts above glowing coals. The sweet roasted smell drifts warmly through the cold afternoon air. He hands you a paper cone filled with steaming chestnuts. The shells crack softly between your fingers, while nearby pedestrians continue exchanging storm stories along the avenue. Everyone seems to possess one now. A rescue witnessed. A terrifying night. A miraculous outdoors. A strange coincidence. Modern historians still disagree over how much folklore surrounding the blizzard emerged immediately afterward versus years later through embellished retellings. Human memory reshapes disasters, constantly blending fear, pride, and imagination together over time. Perhaps that reshaping helped people endure. You continue walking beneath rows of gas lamps no longer needed in daylight. Meltwater drips steadily from portions of the snowbanks now, though freezing temperatures still dominate the streets after sunset. The city feels suspended between recovery and memory, between truth and rumour. And through every crowded bakery, tavern, church, and tenement hallway across Manhattan, people keep telling story beside the fading snow, searching for explanations large enough to match the storm they survived. The doctors begin arriving before sunrise. You notice them moving through the half-cleared streets with black medical bags swinging beside heavy wool coats dusted in snow. Some travel by sled where roads remain blocked. Others walk directly through the frozen avenues because no vehicle can pass. Their faces look exhausted already. Most have not stopped working since the storm began. You follow one physician through lower Manhattan, while pale morning light slowly spreads across the snowbanks. The city still groans beneath winter's weight. Chimneys smoke heavily against the cold sky while labourers shovel narrow channels through packed drifts. The doctor walks quickly despite the ice. People wait for him everywhere. A boy opens a tenement door before the physician even knocks. Warm air spills briefly into the street, carrying smells of soup, damp blankets and coal smoke. Inside the hallway feels crowded and overheated, compared to outdoors. Wet boots line the walls. Voices murmur behind thin doors. Somewhere upstairs, someone coughs continuously. The doctor climbs without hesitation. Medical care in 1888 demanded enormous physical endurance during severe weather. Physicians travelled long distances through dangerous conditions, carrying instruments, medicines, and basic supplies entirely by hand or horse transport. You enter the apartment behind him. The room appears dim except for weak winter light filtering through frosted windows. A woman lies near the stove, wrapped beneath blankets, while her worried husband stands nearby, twisting his cap between rough hands. The physician kneels beside her quietly. His gloves smell faintly of leather snow and antiseptic chemicals. You notice tiredness around his eyes as he checks her breathing and pulse beneath the glow of a kerosene lamp. Outside, wind rattles the windows softly. Inside, everyone whispers. The illness itself seems less dramatic than the conditions surrounding it. Exposure, exhaustion, and cold air worsen ordinary sickness quickly during storms like this. Even minor fevers become frightening when fuel supplies run low and doctors struggle reaching patients. The physician leaves medicine wrapped carefully into paper before moving on again. No lingering. Too many calls remain unanswered. You follow him back through the icy streets where snowmelt now drips slowly from rooftops beneath weak afternoon sunlight. The city smells different today. Less fresh snow, more slush, more horses, more chimney smoke trapped close to the streets. Recovery has its own scent. Near Broadway, a temporary medical station operates inside a church basement. Volunteers distribute hot broth while doctors treat frostbitten hands, chest infections and injuries from collapsing drifts. The room feels packed with heat and noise. Steam rises from wet coats hanging beside the walls. Children sleep across wooden benches while exhausted mothers cradle cups of tea between red-cracked fingers. A nurse passes carrying towels warmed near the stove. The smell of boiled cloth and medicine fills the basement air. One elderly man quietly explains how he became trapped overnight inside a snowbank after losing his direction during the storm. Another patient shows purple fingers stiffened badly from exposure while clearing streets. You hear stories like this constantly now. The blizzard touched every neighbourhood differently, yet nearly everyone carries some physical reminder of those frozen days. A physician near the doorway mutters that he has treated more frostbite this week than during several previous winters combined. Nobody seems surprised. Outside again, sleigh runners scrape against packed snow farther up the avenue. Temporary sled transport appears throughout the city now because wheels still struggle in many districts. The sharp smell of horse sweat follows one passing sled through the cold air. You stop beside a pharmacy where anxious residents crowd the entrance waiting for medicine. Bottles line the windows behind layers of frost and condensation. Inside, pharmacists work quickly beneath gaslight mixing powders, measuring liquids and wrapping remedies in folded paper packets. Their hands move with careful precision despite exhaustion. The room smells strongly of camphor, alcohol, peppermint and coal heat. An old woman near the counter asks quietly whether another storm may arrive soon. No one answers immediately. Fear lingers long after snowfall ends. One physician later wrote that emotional strain became nearly as common as physical illness after the blizzard. Sleeplessness, anxiety, and nervous exhaustion spread through many households once the immediate danger passed. The mind struggles recovering from prolonged uncertainty. You continue toward a crowded boarding house where another doctor arrives carrying a lantern against the growing dusk. Darkness comes early again beneath thick winter clouds gathering above Manhattan. Inside, several tenants wait nervously in the hallway. A child developed fever during the night. The doctor removes his snow-covered coat slowly beside the stove before examining the patient upstairs. You remain below, listening to the building settle around you. Floorboards creak. Someone stirs soup nearby. Coal crackles softly in the furnace. Ordinary sounds suddenly feel comforting after so many days of storm winds. A younger tenant recalls hearing that some doctors became stranded during the blizzard and continued treating patients directly inside hotels or saloons where they happened to take shelter. That sounds entirely believable. The city forced improvisation upon everyone. When the physician finally descends the staircase again, his expression softens slightly. The child will likely recover. Relief moves quietly through the building without dramatic celebration. People simply breathe easier. Outside evening settles across Manhattan once more. Gas lamps flicker alive beside towering snowbanks now stained grey from soot and traffic. The city remains battered, still cold, still crowded, still aching. Yet life continues, threading carefully through the frozen streets where doctors, nurses, pharmacists, volunteers, and exhausted families keep carrying one another through the long aftermath of the storm. And somewhere beyond the drifting smoke above Manhattan tonight, the first hints of approaching spring remain hidden beyond the cold. The bread disappears first. You notice it early one morning while standing inside a crowded grocery downtown. Shelves that normally hold fresh loaves now display only scattered crumbs and empty trays dusted with flour. Customers stare quietly at the gaps. Nobody needs an explanation. The storm interrupted deliveries across railways, docks, and roads all at once. Even as New York slowly digs itself free from the snow, the flow of ordinary supplies remains tangled in ice mud and damaged transport lines. The grocer wipes his hands against his apron nervously. More should arrive tomorrow, he says. Nobody sounds fully convinced. The store smells strongly of onions, damp burlap sacks, and kerosene smoke from hanging lamps. Meltwater drips steadily from boots across the wooden floor while customers clutch baskets against heavy winter coats. Outside the city sloshes between snow and thaw now. The great drifts still tower across many avenues, but portions of Manhattan have begun melting beneath weak March sunlight. Streets turn muddy and uneven. Ice cracks beneath wagon wheels, attempting cautious movement again. Recovery creates chaos too. You purchase potatoes, cabbage, and a small loaf before leaving the store. The bread feels almost warm beneath the cloth wrapping. A woman behind you receives the last milk bottle available that morning. Several disappointed customers turn away immediately after hearing the news. Milk shortages became especially troubling during the blizzard's aftermath, because fresh deliveries spoiled quickly or failed to arrive at all. Families with young children worried constantly about securing safe food supplies during those frozen days. You continue toward a public market reopening beside the partially cleared avenue. Vendors shout half-heartedly across slushy pathways while labourers drag crates through muddy snow. The market smells alive again. Fish, coffee, wet straw, smoke. Salted meat hangs from hooks beneath canvas coverings, yet tension lingers beneath the activity. People buy quickly now. No lingering conversations, no leisurely browsing beside produce stands. Storms teach caution around abundance. A butcher near the corner jokes that New Yorkers would gladly eat boiled boot leather if another blizzard arrived tomorrow. Several listeners laugh uneasily while examining the shrinking meat supply hanging behind him. Humour tastes different during shortages. You pass a line forming outside a bakery farther uptown. The smell drifting from the doorway feels almost hypnotic after days of uncertainty. Fresh bread possesses remarkable emotional power. Inside, bakers work continuously beside glowing ovens while exhausted assistants carry trays through clouds of fuel and steam. Their faces shine with sweat despite the lingering cold outdoors. The room feels wonderfully alive. Dough thumps against wooden tables. Fire crackles beneath brick ovens. Customers clutch paper-wrapped loaves with near-protective affection before stepping back into the slushy streets. One baker mutters that he barely slept during the storm because demand never stopped. People can postpone comfort, not food. You carry your bread carefully beneath your coat while continuing through Manhattan. Snowmelt drips from rooftops now with steady rhythm. The sound follows you through narrow streets like tiny clocks ticking above the city. A horse splashes through grey slush nearby, pulling a heavily loaded supply wagon. The poor creature looks exhausted. Most animals do. Several stable owners later complained that feeding horses became nearly as difficult as feeding people during the worst conditions. Hay deliveries stalled alongside everything else, leaving many working animals under strain. The city depended upon them regardless. You stop near a crowded soup kitchen operating inside a church hall. Steam fogs the windows while volunteers ladle broth into tin bowls for labourers, widows, children and stranded travellers. The smell reaches the street. Beef stock, carrots, pepper, fresh bread. Hunger sharpens every scent enormously. Inside, long tables fill with tired residents warming their hands around steaming bowls. Nobody speaks loudly. Spoons scrape softly against metal while boots dry beside the walls. Simple meals become ceremonial after hardship. A volunteer tells you they served nearly twice the expected number yesterday. Some families still cannot properly cook at home because of coal shortages limit heating and stove use. Fuel matters almost as much as food. You return outside where foggy sunlight filters through smoke hanging low above the thawing streets. Manhattan now appears caught between winter and mud. Snowbanks collapse slowly beside gutters overflowing with icy water. Children splash recklessly through puddles anyway. Children always rediscover joy first. A newspaper seller nearby shouts headlines about incoming supply trains finally reaching portions of the city. After all, pedestrians pause immediately to listen. Relief spreads gradually through conversations now. Not celebration, just relief. A restaurant owner sweeping slush from his doorway recalls feeding stranded strangers for 3 nights straight during the storm because nobody could leave safely. He says the kitchen nearly ran out of onions and coffee by the final morning. Thought there might be mutiny over the coffee, he jokes dryly. Honestly understandable. One surviving account from a boarding house described residents carefully dividing a single loaf among 12 people during the storm's peak when fresh deliveries stopped entirely. The memory stayed vivid decades later, not because of starvation, but because ordinary food suddenly felt uncertain. Scarcity changes perception quickly. You pause near the waterfront where new shipments finally unload beneath grey skies and dripping snowbanks. Dock workers carry sacks of flour, barrels of apples, crates of canned goods, and bundles of firewood into the recovering city. The smell of oranges drifts through the damp air again, bright and almost cheerful. Nearby women bargain urgently beside a produce wagon, while children watch wide-eyed at the sight of fresh fruit returning after days of shortages. The city exhales slowly, not all at once, but enough to notice. As evening approaches, chimneys begin smoking heavily across Manhattan once more while families carry bread, cold soup bones, potatoes, candles, and small comforts home through the slush-filled streets. And after days spent fearing empty shelves and frozen roads, the simple act of bringing food indoors begins feeling quietly miraculous. The conversations begin underground, not literally at first. You hear them. Inside newspaper offices, crowded taverns, city meeting halls and smoke-filled railway stations where frustrated men stamp slush from their boots while arguing over the future of New York. The storm exposed something embarrassing. The city could be stopped. You stand near the back of a crowded transit office, where engineers and journeymen gather around maps spread across a long wooden table. Outside, snowmelt drips steadily from rooftops, while wagons struggle through muddy streets still choked with ice. Inside, tempers rise with the room's heat. The air smells strongly of wet wool, cigar smoke, ink, and coal fire. Several men gesture sharply towards sketches of elevated railways blocked during the blizzard. Too exposed, one insists. Another points toward telegraph failures. A third complains about frozen tracks trapping commuters for hours above the streets. Nobody seems eager to relive those memories. Before the blizzard elevated, trains symbolized modern progress across New York. Steel tracks carried thousands efficiently above crowded avenues each day, yet during the storm, snow and wind overwhelmed the system completely. That failure changed public thinking. You leave the office and walk south beside partially cleared streets where workers still chop through hardened ice along the curbs. Manhattan sounds louder now than during the storm days. Hammering, shouting, Horse traffic, steam whistles returning faintly from the harbour. The city regains its rhythm slowly. Still reminders remain everywhere. Twisted telegraph wires hang from damaged poles. Snowbanks tower beside muddy crossings. Several abandoned rail cars remain frozen along distant tracks. A street vendor selling roasted chestnuts tells nearby customers that trains should run beneath the streets instead of above them. People laugh at first. Then they continue discussing the idea seriously. The smell of coal smoke thickens as evening approaches. Chimneys work constantly now against lingering cold dampness settling across the recovering city. You pass a crowded cafe where newspaper headlines discuss infrastructure failures and future improvements. Nearly every table contains some version of the same conversation. How do you protect a growing city from another storm like this? Some men advocate stronger elevated systems. Others demand better snow removal crews. A few insist underground rail tunnels represent the only reliable solution. The idea sounds almost fantastical to many residents. Digging trains beneath Manhattan Street seems wildly ambitious during the 1880s. Yet the blizzard gave the proposal sudden emotional force. Fear motivates engineering remarkably well. You step inside the cafe seeking warmth and coffee. Steam fogs the windows while waiters move carefully between crowded tables, balancing cups and bowls. The room hums with argument. One businessman claims London already proved underground railways possible. Another worries tunneling beneath Manhattan would collapse entire neighbourhoods into chaos and mud. A young clerk listening nearby quietly says anything sounds preferable to freezing inside stalled trains again. No one disagrees. Several municipal reports written after the blizzard criticised how vulnerable above-ground infrastructure remained during severe weather. Transportation failures disrupted commerce, emergency response communication, and basic movement across the city. New York suddenly looked fragile despite its wealth and size. You continue walking afterward toward a partially restored elevated station. Workers chip ice from steel supports while passengers queue impatiently beneath dripping platforms. The smell here feels mechanical. Oil, smoke, hot metal, wet timber. Steam engines hiss somewhere beyond the station, while conductors shout updated schedules through the cold air. People remain wary of the trains now. You notice passengers studying the sky repeatedly, as if expecting another storm to emerge without warning. Weather leaves emotional scars invisible from a distance. A railway worker near the tracks recalls how stranded passengers climbed ladders down from frozen trains during the worst night of the blizzard. He shakes his head slowly while speaking. Never saw fear like that before, he mutters. Nearby, another worker insists underground railroads would flood constantly beneath Manhattan. The debate continues while both men shovel slush from the platform. The future often begins as an argument beside hard labour. You walk farther uptown where city crews inspect damaged utility lines and buried track switches. Engineers carrying notebooks step carefully through mud and melting snow while discussing measurements and repair estimates. One particularly muddy intersection still traps wagon wheels completely. Drivers curse with impressive creativity. A curious rumour spreads through portions of the city that secret underground passages already exist beneath Manhattan from earlier transit experiments. Most versions of the story sound wildly exaggerated, though old tunnels and infrastructure projects certainly did exist beneath portions of the growing city. New Yorkers enjoy imagining hidden worlds beneath their feet. You pause near a public lecture hall where several civic leaders gather for an evening discussion about urban modernization after the storm. Lanterns glow warmly through the windows while carriages line the muddy street outside. Inside, the audience appears restless but attentive. The speaker describes future transit systems protected from snow, wind and frozen tracks. He speaks of tunnels, electric lighting and stronger communication networks connecting the expanding city more reliably. Some listeners nod eagerly. Others appear skeptical. Still, the room listens carefully. The blizzard changed imaginations as much as streets. Historians examining the period often point toward the storm as a turning point in public support for underground transit expansion in New York. The disaster did not create the subway idea entirely, but it gave the concept urgency and political momentum impossible to ignore afterward. You leave the lecture hall after dark. Gas lamps shimmer across wet streets where snowbanks slowly shrink into dirty grey walls beside the avenues. Meltwater trickles steadily through gutters while the city moves around you with growing confidence again. Not fully recovered, not yet, but already planning. That feels very New York somehow. Even while digging itself from disaster, the city keeps imagining larger versions of itself ahead. And beneath the muddy streets where workers splash through melting snow tonight, future tunnels already begin forming quietly inside the minds of exhausted survivors. You begin noticing the workers nobody talks about in newspapers. Not the politicians, not the wealthy hotel owners, not the dramatic rescue stories shouted across headlines. The quieter people, the ones already awake before dawn while Manhattan still sleeps beneath melting snowbanks and dripping rooftops. A janitor pushes slush from a boarding house entrance with slow, determined movements. His shovel scrapes wet ice across the pavement while weak morning light spreads between the buildings. Nearby, a woman empties ash buckets from a furnace room into the alley behind a restaurant. Her sleeves smell strongly of smoke and soap. Farther uptown, stable workers brush exhausted horses beneath hanging lanterns while steam rises from the animals into the cold air. The city survives because thousands of invisible tasks continue happening. You walk through the recovering streets listening carefully. Hammering echoes from repair crews fixing damaged signs and shutters. Coal wagons rumble again over muddy intersections. Somewhere nearby, a cook chops vegetables beside an open kitchen window. The smell drifts outward warmly. Garlic, onions, fresh bread, wet wood smoke. Ordinary life returns through labour first. You stop beside a narrow laundry shop where women work beside enormous steaming tubs despite the lingering cold. Their hands move constantly through soap fabric, boiling water and heavy wet linens. The windows fog completely from heat. Inside sounds busy and rhythmic. Water splashing, fabric snapping, quiet conversation in several languages. One woman laughs softly while wringing melted snow from a wool coat so soaked it nearly doubles in weight. The storm created endless work afterward. Dirty blankets, frozen clothing, water-damaged linens, mud tracked through every hallway in Manhattan. Nothing cleaned itself. You continue downtown where street sweepers struggle against mountains of filthy slush forming along the curbs. Their boots sink into grey ice mixed with horse manure, ash and melting snow. It smells terrible. Truly terrible. The elegant white storm has transformed into muddy city reality again. Yet even that feels reassuring somehow. Mess means movement. You pass a bakery before sunrise where workers already knead dough beneath yellow gaslight. Flour coats their sleeves while ovens radiate fierce heat through the room. One baker pauses briefly near the doorway, breathing cold morning air before returning inside. His face shines with exhaustion. He probably worked through half the storm. A waiter carrying bread crates down the sidewalk nearly slips beside a melting snowbank. He steadies himself without dropping anything and keeps moving immediately. No drama, just continuation. A porter outside a grand hotel sweeps endless dirty snow away from the entrance, while wealthy guests step carefully around him discussing train schedules and theatre reopenings. He remains nearly invisible to them. That happens often in large cities. You notice the smell of coffee drifting from basement kitchens all across Manhattan now. Restaurant workers and boarding house cooks rise before daylight preparing meals for labour crews rebuilding the city. Huge pots simmer constantly. Soup, stew, coffee thick enough to wake the dead. A young kitchen boy carries sacks of potatoes down icy cellar stairs while muttering complaints under his breath. Another worker scrubs soot from cooking pans blackened during the storm. The city eats because people perform exhausting repetitive work nobody remembers later. You enter a small diner crowded with labourers warming themselves before another day of clearing streets and repairing damage. The room feels humid from steam and damp coats. Forks clatter softly against thick ceramic plates. Bacon crackles near the stove. Someone coughs into a handkerchief beside the window. The waitress moves quickly between tables, balancing coffee pots and bowls without ever fully stopping. Her shoes leave melted snowprints across the floorboards. You suspect she has not rested properly in days. At one corner table, two repair workers discuss frozen water pipes bursting inside an apartment building overnight. Another man complains about hauling coal through knee-deep slush all morning. Nobody sounds heroic. Just tired. That feels more honest somehow. Outside again, sunlight glints weakly across shrinking snowbanks lining the avenues. Meltwater drips steadily from awnings and rooftops now. Every few minutes, heavy chunks of snow collapse suddenly into the street below. People instinctively step aside without looking up anymore. You pass a barber reopening his shop after days stranded at home during the storm. He sweeps melted slush toward the gutter while humming quietly to himself. Nearby, a delivery driver curses at a wagon wheel stuck in muddy ice. A chimney sweep emerges blackened with soot from a narrow rooftop ladder. A woman shakes snow-soaked rugs from a tenement window. The city rebuilds itself through thousands of ordinary motions repeated endlessly. One night, Watchman tells you he spent the storm sleeping beside a furnace because the building owner feared pipes freezing solid. Another admits he barely saw daylight for 2 days while hauling coal between basements. No newspaper prints their names. Still without them, Manhattan stops functioning entirely. The smell of thawing streets grows stronger by afternoon. Mud horse traffic, sewage smoke and wet wood blend together beneath the lingering cold. Not pleasant, but deeply alive. You reach the harbour, again near sunset, where dock workers continue unloading cargo beneath pale orange skies streaked with smoke. Their movements appear slower now from accumulated exhaustion, yet the ships keep arriving, the crates keep moving, the city keeps breathing. One worker pauses briefly beside the pier railing, staring across the water toward Brooklyn, glowing faintly beneath the evening light. Then he lifts another crate and continues. That quiet endurance exists everywhere around you now. In laundries, kitchens, stable yards, furnace rooms, street crews, boarding houses, market stalls. The storm may have become famous, but survival belonged mostly to ordinary people whose names disappeared into the noise of the city almost immediately afterward. And as dusk settles softly across Manhattan tonight, those forgotten workers continue sweeping, cooking, hauling, washing, feeding, repairing and carrying the recovering city forward, one exhausted task at a time. Night settles differently after the storm. You feel it while walking through Manhattan beneath rows of gas lamps flickering against damp streets and shrinking snowbanks. The city no longer carries the violent terror of those first blizzard nights. Now it feels tired, deeply tired. The wind has mostly faded, leaving behind softer sounds that drift through the cold darkness. Footsteps splash through slush. Wagon wheels creak carefully over frozen ruts. Distant voices echo between buildings still lined with dirty snow. You pull your coat tighter while moving along Broadway. The air smells of melting ice, chimney smoke, damp horses and coal fires burning steadily behind thousands of windows. Warm yellow light glows through curtains and frosted glass all across the avenue. People stay indoors earlier now. Crowded restaurants still operate. Saloons remain open, but the city quiets fast after sunset since the blizzard. Something about those terrible nights lingers inside everyone. A restaurant pianist plays softly near an open doorway as you pass. The melody drifts gently into the cold air before dissolving beneath the sounds of the street. You stop briefly beside a newspaper office where late editions still print beneath glowing windows. Workers move inside like shadows through steam and whoop. The presses never fully rest. Neither does New York. Farther downtown, a patrolman walks slowly along the avenue carrying a lantern, beside drifting patches of fog rising from the thawing streets. His boots splash through puddles, reflecting gaslight like broken gold across the pavement. The snowbanks appear smaller each night now, grey, uneven, softening around the edges. Yet enough remain to remind everyone how recently the city nearly disappeared beneath them. You enter a small cafe seeking warmth before continuing home. The room feels calmer than during the storm itself. No frantic crowds, no desperate rumours, just weary conversation. A waitress wipes tables beside the stove while several customers sip coffee in comfortable silence. Steam fogs portions of the windows nearest the kitchen. The smell inside feels soothing. Coffee, tobacco, fresh soup, wet wool slowly drying in the oil. Pal race to the fire. At one table, two men discuss rail repairs already underway farther uptown. Another quietly describes seeing stranded passengers rescued from buried streetcars days earlier. Nobody raises their V. The storm no longer feels immediate enough for panic, but not distant enough for jokes either. You finish your coffee slowly before stepping outside again into the cold evening. The sky above Manhattan appears unusually clear tonight between drifting chimney smoke. A few stars emerge faintly overhead. That sight alone comforts people more than expected after so many days of swirling grey skies. Along certain streets, children still play beside snowbanks under the watch of tired parents bundled in scarves and shawls. Their laughter sounds softer at night somehow, more fragile. A horse pulling a late delivery wagon snorts clouds of steam into the freezing air while its driver hums quietly beneath his breath. Nearby workers extinguish lanterns beside a repaired section of track before heading home through the slush. The city slowly folds itself inward after dark. Window by window, lamp by lamp, inside boarding houses, tenements and hotels residents settle beside stoves listening to pipes creak and coal fires crackle softly against the lingering cold. You pass one apartment building where someone plays violin near an open window upstairs. The melody floats gently into the street above the dripping sounds of melting snow. Elsewhere, a woman sings quietly while rocking a child to sleep. Ordinary nighttime sounds return little by little. A man sweeping outside his tavern pauses long enough to mention how strange the silence felt during the storm's worst hours. Like the city vanished, he says, before returning to work. You understand exactly what he means. New York depends upon noise almost as much as movement. Without constant sound, the city feels incomplete. You continue toward the waterfront, where fog gathers low above the harbour. Ships sound distant whistles through the darkness, while icy water knocks softly against the docks. The smell there feels sharper tonight. Salt water, wet rope, cold iron, faint fish markets still lingering from daytime trade. Lantern light sways across the piers, where a few late workers finish unloading cargo beneath heavy coats and wool caps. Their movements appear slow and mechanical from exhaustion. Still they continue. You pause beside the railing, staring across the dark river towards scattered lights shimmering through mist and soak. The harbour no longer feels trapped by the storm, only bruised by it. Behind you, Manhattan glows warmly beneath rows of lamps and chimney smoke rising into the freezing night sky. One boarding house window opens briefly above the avenue. A woman shakes crumbs from a cloth before closing the window quickly against the cold. Tiny domestic rituals return. That matters more than people realise. Inside homes across the city, boots dry beside stoves. Soup simmers quietly. Families discuss missing relatives now safely returned. Children fall asleep listening not to roaring wind, but to ordinary creaking floorboards and distant wagon traffic. Safety sounds subtle after danger. You turn back toward the crowded streets where gaslight reflects across puddles formed from melting snow. The city remains scarred and exhausted, yet unmistakably alive again. And beneath the calm dark sky above Manhattan tonight, thousands of tired residents finally drift toward proper sleep while the storm slowly retreats into memory. Morning arrives bright and almost painfully clear. You wake to sunlight pouring across Manhattan for the first time since the blizzard began. The storm clouds have finally broken apart completely, leaving a pale blue sky stretched above the recovering city. For several moments, everything looks beautiful. Then you notice the damage. You step outside into cold air sharp enough to sting your lungs. Snowbanks still rise along the avenues, though many now sag and drip steadily beneath the sunlight. Meltwater runs through gutters, carrying ash straw, broken wood, and scraps of frozen newspaper downhill toward the harbour. The city smells wet now. Wet brick, wet horses, wet coal smoke. The clean scent of fresh snow disappeared days ago beneath thawing streets and crowded traffic returning to motion. Still, people stop constantly just to stare around them. The scale of the storm becomes fully visible only after the skies clear. You walk south through a Broadway where enormous piles of snow remain stacked beside partially reopened trolley lines. Some drifts still stand taller than wagons. Others reveal buried objects slowly emerging from the ice like artifacts uncovered after centuries. A wheel, a fence post, half a signboard, one unfortunate mailbox. Children climb the shrinking snow hills laughing while exhausted adults continue shoveling pathways nearby. The contrast feels strange. For children, the storm already becomes adventure. For everyone else, it remains work. You pass a photographer setting up equipment near an intersection where snow towers almost to the second floor of a building. Several pedestrians pause curiously while he prepares the shot. People understand this storm will be remembered. Photographs from the blizzard later spread across newspapers and postcards because the scale seemed nearly unbelievable once normal life resumed. Images of buried streets fascinated people across the country. Honestly, they still would today. You continue walking while sunlight flashes brightly across ice, hanging from rooftops and telegraph wires. The city glitters in places despite the damage. Almost too brightly, you squint against the reflection bouncing from every remaining snowbank. Near an elevated railway station, workers chip thick ice from steel supports while engineers inspect damaged sections of track. The sounds echo through the avenue sharply. Metal striking ice. Shovels scree? Bitten stone. Steam hissing from nearby engines. The city rebuilding itself one noise at a time. A man beside you points toward a stranded railcar still trapped along the elevated line. Been sitting there since the second night, he mutters quietly. Passengers are gone now. Only the frozen shell remains. You pass storefronts reopening cautiously beneath hand-painted signs reading, "Open again." Some windows remain cracked or boarded. Others display muddy footprints across freshly cleaned floors. Shopkeepers sweep endlessly. There is always more dirt. A fruit vendor arranges oranges and apples carefully atop wooden crates outside his stand. The bright colours look almost shocking after days dominated by white snow and grey slush. The smell of citrus drifts warmly through the cold morning air. Nearby, another vendor sells hot chestnuts beside a steaming cart while labourers gather briefly for warmth and conversation. People talk differently now, less fearful, more reflective. Everyone compares the memories of the storm, where they were stranded, who helped them, which streets disappeared first, how deep the drifts reached beside certain buildings. The blizzard already transforms into shared mythology. You reach a section of Lower Manhattan, where snow-clearing crews have created narrow corridors between enormous walls of packed ice. Walking there feels almost like moving through frozen canyons. Sunlight barely reaches the bottom. Water drips steadily from the towering sides. A horse pulling a coal wagon hesitates nervously before entering one passage. The animal's hooves slip slightly against hidden ice beneath the slush. Its driver speaks gently while guiding it forward. Everyone moves more carefully after surviving something frightening. Near the harbour, broken telegraph poles lie stacked beside repair crews stringing wires overhead. Workers balance atop ladders while bundled pedestrians watch from below. Communication returns slowly. You overhear one repairman joke that the city should simply train pigeons instead next winter. Another replies that pigeons probably possess more common sense than politicians. Several listeners laugh immediately. Laughter sounds easier now. The waterfront itself appears transformed beneath the clear sky. Ice still floats across portions of the river, while tugboats move carefully through open channels. Ships unload cargo again beneath the cries of gulls circling overhead. The harbour smells alive. Salt water, fish, coal smoke, tar warming faintly beneath the sun. You stop beside a church where melted snow pours from the roof in steady streams beside the entrance. Inside, candles flicker softly while several residents kneel quietly in the morning light. Perhaps giving thanks, perhaps simply resting. The city endured tremendous strain during those days, yet ordinary routines already begin reclaiming the streets. Deliveries resume, schools reopen gradually, newspaper boys shout headlines with renewed energy. Even theatre posters reappear. New York cannot remain paused for long. Still signs of the blizzard linger everywhere your eyes travel. Frost-damaged walls, bent railings, exhausted horses, deep ruts frozen into muddy roads. And beneath it all, a lingering awareness that nature briefly overwhelmed one of the busiest cities in America without much effort at all. You continue walking while afternoon light softens across the avenues. Smoke rises lazily from chimneys into the clear blue sky overhead. The storm finally feels over. Not forgotten. Never that. But finished. And as Manhattan slowly dries beneath the returning sunlight, survivors carry their memories forward through streets that no longer look buried yet will never feel entirely ordinary again. The city begins digging tunnels through itself. Not underground railways this time, snow tunnels. You walk through one near Midtown early in the morning, while workers carve narrow passageways between towering walls of dirty packed ice. The snow rises above your head on both sides, streaked grey from soot and horse traffic. The air inside feels strangely still, quieter than the open avenues. Your boots crunch over packed slush while sunlight filters weakly down from the narrow opening overhead. Every few moments, water drips from the frozen walls onto your shoulders or hat brim. The thaw continues, slowly. The city smells heavy now. Wet snow mixes with mud manure, chimney smoke, and rotting straw scattered from stable yards. The fresh, clean scent of winter disappeared days ago. This is spring trying to arrive through exhaustion. You emerge from the tunnel beside a busy intersection where dozens of workers attack the remaining drifts with shovels and iron picks. Horses pull enormous sleds piled high with snow toward dumping areas near the river. No one moves leisurely. Recovery has become its own form of industry. A foreman shouts directions through a cloud of steam rising from nearby sewer grates. His voice competes against wagon wheels hammering and the constant scrape of metal against ice. The city sounds fully awake again. You pause near a repair crew reinstalling telegraph wires above the avenue. One worker balances carefully on a ladder while another untangles coils of frozen cable below. Their gloves look soaked through. Nobody seems to care anymore. Several shopkeepers nearby reopen their businesses completely for the first time since the blizzard. Fresh signs hang above cleaned windows while delivery boys rush packages through the slushy streets. A tailor beats melted snow from rugs outside his doorway. A bookseller stacks dry newspapers beside the entrance. A flower vendor places early spring blossoms near the curb despite the snowbank still towering behind him. That sight feels almost stubborn. Tiny flowers against mountains of dirty ice. You continue downtown where elevated trains finally move again along repaired tracks overhead. The sound startles you at first. Metal grinding, steam hissing, passengers cheering softly from windows. The city regains one piece of itself at a time. Inside a crowded cafe, businessmen discuss lost revenue while labourers nearby compare stories about frozen streets and impossible work shifts during the storm. Everyone measures time differently now. Before the blizzard, during the blizzard, after the blizzard. The waitress moves between tables, carrying coffee and thick slices of bread, while condensation clouds the windows beside her. The room smells warm and alive. Coffee grounds, cigar smoke, soup stock simmering near the kitchen, wet wool drying beside the stove. A man near the corner table claims he walked 5 miles through chest-deep drifts to reach his family after trains stopped running. Another insists the drifts reached second-story windows near his neighbourhood. Neither story sounds impossible anymore. Outside again, sunlight glitters across puddles stretching through the streets. The melting snow reveals damaged cobblestones, broken wagon wheels, and scattered debris hidden beneath the drifts for days. Children gather around every strange object uncovered by the thaw. A buried bench, a frozen hat, part of a street sign, one muddy boot with no visible owner nearby. The city reveals itself slowly. Near the waterfront, enormous snow piles still wait beside the docks where workers continue hauling them toward the river. The harbour smells stronger now beneath the warming temperatures. Saltwater, fish, wet timber, coal smoke drifting low across the piers. You watch labourers unload fresh cargo while gulls scream overhead through pale afternoon light. Commerce returns with almost desperate energy. New York dislikes standing still. A carriage driver cleaning slush from his wheels mutters that the city already acts as though nothing happened. Yet his hands keep moving while he speaks, brushing mud and ice from the spokes with careful attention. Perhaps forgetting helps people continue. Perhaps rebuilding does. You pass several newly repaired telegraph offices buzzing with activity again. Clerks carry stacks of messages through crowded rooms while operators lean over clicking machines restored after days of silence. The city reconnects with the outside world. News arrives rapidly now from Boston, Philadelphia, Washington, and beyond. Reports of storm damage stretch across the northeast, though New Yorkers naturally remain convinced their suffering was the worst. Cities possess ego too. Farther uptown, work crews dismantle one of the last enormous drifts blocking a major crossing. Shovels rise and fall rhythmically beneath the afternoon sun while passing pedestrians pause to watch. The snow has hardened almost like old stone. Each strike sends glittering chunks sliding across the street. Nearby, a group of boys immediately begins climbing the shrinking pile despite repeated warnings from exhausted workers. Some things never change. You stop near a public square where benches finally emerge from beneath the melting snow. Couples sit there, cautiously enjoying sunlight while children chase one another around muddy puddles. The city begins relaxing again. Not completely. A nervousness still lingers whenever dark clouds gather overhead or sudden winds sweep through the avenues. But daily routines slowly push fear aside. Dinner reservations return. Theatres reopen. Street musicians appear again beside crowded corners. You hear piano music drifting from an upper apartment window as evening approaches. The melody carries softly through cooling air scented with smoke and thawing earth. Manhattan looks different now. Not buried anymore, not fully clean either, just alive, scarred and noisy and restless beneath fading sunlight. And while workers continue clearing the final remnants of the great blizzard from streets, tracks, rooftops, and memories, the city already pushes itself forward toward the next season, waiting beyond the last walls of melting snow. Years pass, then more years, yet the blizzard never fully leaves New York. You feel that truth while walking through Manhattan, long after the snow itself has vanished. The streets bustle again with electric lights, crowded rail stations, shouting vendors, and endless movement pushing through the growing city. But older residents still talk about March of 1888 in lowered voices during winter storms. They remember. A shopkeeper pauses beside his doorway during falling snow and quietly says, "Nothing like the great blizzard, though." A retired policeman recalls guiding strangers through white-out streets using rope lines tied between lampposts. An elderly woman still stores extra coal every winter because she remembers empty shelves and frozen roads. Memory settles into habits. The city changed after surviving that storm. You walk beside one of the new underground railway entrances years later, while crowds disappear beneath the streets in warm electric light. Trains roar invisibly below Manhattan now, protected from wind and snow above. People descend the stairs without much thought. Yet the blizzard helped place those tunnels there. Disaster forced imagination into action. The city smells different now too. Less horse traffic, more electricity and machinery. Still winter mornings carry familiar traces of smoke and frozen air drifting between the buildings. Certain sensations never disappear completely. A sudden icy wind, wet wool drying near a stove, the scrape of shovels before dawn. You continue through neighborhoods rebuilt and expanded since the storm. Taller buildings rise overhead now. New bridges stretch across the rivers. Technology pushes forward relentlessly. Yet winter still humbles people occasionally. A newspaper boy racing through falling snow reminds older pedestrians of another generation carrying headlines during the blizzard. A crowded cafe during bad weather still gathers strangers together around warmth and conversation. Human behavior changes more slowly than architecture. You stop beside a public square where children play near patches of fresh snow beneath gaslights and electric lamps glowing side by side. Their laughter drifts softly through the cold evening air. None of them understand how terrifying the city once looked beneath mountains of drifting white. Perhaps that is good. Not every memory needs inheriting completely. A grey-haired dock worker sitting outside a coffee stall points toward the harbour, while describing frozen ferries trapped in the storm decades earlier. His hands still move unconsciously while speaking as though remembering the labour physically. The harbour behind him remains busy tonight. Ships arrive. Whistles echo. Cargo cranes creak. New York survived because it refused staying still for long. You wander farther downtown where old brick buildings still stand beside newer steel structures. The city layers itself constantly. Old storms beneath new streets, old fears beneath new inventions. A woman passing beside you tightens her coat against the cold wind. For one brief second you imagine the blizzard returning, the white sky, the buried avenues, the roaring wind between buildings. Then the moment passes, streetcars rattle nearby. Laughter rises from a restaurant doorway. Life continues. You realize the storm changed more than transportation or infrastructure. It changed how people understood vulnerability itself. The largest city in America discovered that progress could freeze solid beneath enough snow and wind. That realization lingered. Perhaps it still does. You enter a warm cafe as evening deepens across Manhattan. Inside, lamps glow softly above polished tables, while coffee steams beside frosted windows. The room smells comforting. Bread, tobacco, roasted meat, fresh coffee. A violinist plays quietly near the back corner while snowflakes drift lazily outside beneath the streetlights. Nothing dangerous tonight, just winter. You sit near the window, listening to the low murmur of conversation around you. Nearby customers discuss work schedules, politics, rising rents, and tomorrow's weather forecast. Tomorrow's weather. Weather. The phrase alone would have sounded uncertain during the blizzard years earlier, when telegraph lines failed and rumours travelled faster than facts. Now the city's trusts forecast more confidently. Mostly. Still somewhere deep inside older residents keep one eye on the sky whenever snow begins falling heavily. You finish your coffee slowly before stepping back outside into the cold evening air. Snow dusts the sidewalks lightly now, nothing more. The city glows warmly around you. Windows shimmer gold above the streets. Carriages pass through soft pools of light. Far below, underground trains carry thousands safely beneath the winter weather that once paralyzed Manhattan entirely. You walk without hurry. The night feels calm, cold but calm, and as you move through the city that survived the Great Blizzard of 1888, you begin noticing how survival itself leaves quiet marks upon places and people. Extra blankets folded carefully away each spring. Coal stored a little earlier than necessary. Stories repeated beside fireplaces during storms. Small preparations nobody laughs at anymore. The blizzard fades into history slowly but never completely. Even now, years later, traces remain hidden beneath the city like old tracks buried under snow. The streets continue humming softly around you, while snowflakes drift through the glow of the lamps overhead. The air smells faintly of smoke and winter and distant seawater from the harbour. You breathe deeply. The city breathes with you. And little by little, the long, frozen memory of the storm settles gently into the background of the night, quieter, now softer now, until Manhattan itself seems to exhale beneath the calm winter sky. You continue walking. No rushing. No fear. Only the steady rhythm of footsteps through the sleeping city while warm light glows behind the windows and the cold air brushes gently against your face. The storm is over. The city endured. And tonight, at last, you may finally rest. Sleep well,